The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 351, Austrian version of M42. August 3rd, 1842. Tyrol Arsenal. The design of this helmet is really weird, isn't it? Said a weapons researcher. Don't talk nonsense. This is the design of Archduke Franz, and it must be a revolution in the history of helmets, said Vincenz August, the chief weapons designer of the Austrian Empire. What if this proves to be a failure? Said another young weapons researcher. What do you want? Blame a 12-year-old child, or admit your mistake? Vincenzo August said angrily. To be honest, he doesn't like today's young people very much. These people have no idea how high the sky is, and they always want to let big shots take care of themselves. Don't they have no sense of responsibility? In fact, everyone wants to take the benefits themselves and let others take the blame. But there is always someone to do the work. When the researchers heard the words of their immediate boss, they naturally understood the meaning. But this is so ugly. It's not elegant at all. It's like a pot being placed on the soldier's head. Is it because you want the enemy to laugh to death? The young man's words gave Vincenz inspiration, and he said quickly, "You idiots, this helmet is obviously designed to make it easier for soldiers to cook food." Everyone looked at each other. Look at the design of this round hole. It is obviously used for hooks. If you put firewood underneath, it can be used to make soup, water, and coffee. Vincenz analyzed it seriously. But don't the army's cooking classes have pots, idiot? What if someone poisons the cauldron? What should the team do when they are on a mission? What should they do if they encounter a plague? Vincenz asked. After hearing this, everyone felt that it seemed to make sense. After several days of intense communication, the Austrian version of the M42 pod helmet was born. Although it is also called M42, it is different from the historical M42. The first is that the Austrian version was manufactured in 1842, while the German version was manufactured in 1942. The difference between the two is exactly 100 years. Secondly, the Austrian version of the M42 pod helmet is a pod first and a helmet second. In fact, the helmet is not bulletproof, so these designers are very confused about its use. In fact, even if the bullet did not penetrate the helmet, the huge impact would still be unbearable on the person's neck. Not to mention the helmets at this time. Even the helmets from the World War II period also did not have the function of blocking direct rifle fire, but they could block some ricochet and stray bullets. This kind of bullet has lost most of its kinetic energy, but flesh and blood still cannot resist it. A helmet may be able to save a soldier's life on the battlefield. In addition, the most important function is actually to defend against shrapnel and gravel generated by shelling. These things are the deadliest on the future battlefield. In the future, there will be more and more explosives such as artillery, grenades, and mines on the battlefield, and they will become more and more important. If you want to survive on the cruel battlefield, you need a hat that can withstand fragments. An assault helmet is essential. In fact, apart from the material, the Austrian version of the M42 is more advanced than the German version of the M42 100 years later. For example, the camouflage design avoids reflection, which greatly ensures the safety during secret marches. At the same time, the fabric can also reduce the number of helmets. Secondary damage caused to soldiers by fragmentation and deformation. Of course, 4-color camouflage can also help soldiers better integrate into various terrains and avoid enemy hunting. It's just that people haven't realized this yet and just regard it as a child's graffiti. In fact, during the manufacturing process, weapons experts discovered that if camouflage cloth was used on both sides, the pot helmet would lose its function as a kitchen utensil. Ever since, after studying for a period of time, this group of experts decided to adopt a mesh pocket design internally. This can not only have a concealing effect, but also reduce the probability of breakage, and can also use the helmet as a pot point. It's just that the operation is a little more troublesome, and you need to take off the camouflage cloth on the outside of the helmet frequently. The first batch of helmets were first equipped by Franz's Royal 1st Dragoon Regiment in Salzburg and the Marines under Friedrich. Both units were elite, and they were Franz and Friedrich respectively. He is directly under Derek, and will not spread the information about the helmet to other places. Of course, this kind of thing cannot be hidden, even if you want to, and the cost of imitation technology is very low, but Franz still hopes to take advantage of it as much as possible. After all, other countries in the world have not yet realized this. The importance and value of a new type of helmet. On September 1, 1842, the Chancellery of the Austrian Empire welcomed a group of uninvited guests. A group of girls wearing sun hats and luxurious dresses stepped out of more than a dozen luxuriously decorated carriages. They are the scribes of the Prime Minister's office who have just joined the job. As a model of old-hearted and immortal Metternich, the nearly 70-year-old Prime Minister strongly supports graduates of the Royal College for Women to work in the government. With the support of the royal family and the Prime Minister's office, no one dared to drop people on the trees and burn them on fire this time. Thalia said this was unfair. Although there were hundreds of graduates, according to the concept at the time, it was very shameful for women to go out to work. So only 15 students finally joined the workforce. Although it was just a matter of words to let him become a civil servant, there were still many troubles to solve later, so Franz could only ask his experienced teacher, and Metternich also used his actions to confirm the sentence: a man is a boy until he dies. The Prime Minister took meticulous care of these scribes who could be his granddaughter's ordinary officialdom. Conflicts are nothing to mention in front of him, and with the Prime Minister around, most people really don't dare to make themselves unhappy, just for the so-called face. In terms of work, everyone in the public sector knows the difference between having a master, or being protected by family elders, and being a lone wolf. Metternich used a short time and a few small things to make these girls understand things that normally would take them decades to understand. Of course, on the other hand, old gentlemen like Metternich could easily attract these little girls. Fortunately, Metternich was no longer young at this time, otherwise the scapegoat might not have survived until 1848. But since then, Metternich has also been nicknamed Grandpa Metternich, but in general he still likes this kind of life, which makes him feel a lot younger. Count Korolaf protested. He felt that the Ministry of Finance was the place where women should be. As soon as these words came out, the bachelors in the Ministry of Finance expressed their determination to follow the minister to the death. In fact, the Royal College for Women in Vienna has an accounting major among its university subjects, and 2 people are currently enrolling in the course. Franz revealed this to Count Korolaf through Thalia, who immediately began a funding plan. This is a reform of the bureaucracy. It would be much easier if it were done from top to bottom. On the contrary, it would be extremely difficult. Franz deliberately created it as a scarce resource for departments to compete for, rather than the so-called equal distribution, causing a boycott by various departments. Franz took the first step to increase the number of working people and officials, but there was still a long way to go. Chapter 352 Big Business. April 21, 1842. Northern Italy, Savoy. As Alberto's eldest son, Vittorio married Mary Adelaide of the Habsburg family, the daughter of the governor of Venetia, which seemed to prove that Savoy was moving closer to the Austrian Empire. However, just one day later, King Carlo Alberto I of the Kingdom of Sardinia signed a trade agreement with the French. I won't go into details, but the result was that it turned into another trade agreement between France and Austria after Bavaria. Second deal of the game between Habsburg and Bourbon in Italy has been going on for hundreds of years, and both sides are not surprised by Savoy's actions. The Austrian Empire pulled the Papal States and a group of its relatives to form the Apennine Commercial Alliance, and France pulled Sardinia and its relatives in southern Italy who had not good relations to form the Western Mediterranean Alliance. Of course, France and Austria are competing for hegemony. How could Britain, the troublemaker, not get involved? With British help, the Pan-Mediterranean Free Trade Association was established. The British logic is very simple. they will beat whoever is strong, maintain the independent status of these countries, and prevent any country from becoming bigger. Of course, the most important thing is to organize these countries to serve as their own economic colonies and vanguard point. In fact, with the development of industrialization, European countries no longer tend to trade protection, but to free trade. Because every country feels that it has an advantage and can crush other countries. Italy became the first battlefield in the name of free trade. Why not Germany? Because the German customs union shut out most of the forces of Britain and France, and Bavaria's consciousness was a little higher than that of the Kingdom of Sardinia. It's just that this time Austria is not busy investing too much manpower and material resources to seize the market in Sardinia or southern Italy. Instead, it is enclosing the territory as it did in the past. The economy in southern France is poor, and it is possible for the Austrians to attack with all their strength to create a gap in the south. Austria is not afraid of the British at all in the competition for high-end industrial products. But so what? This does not bring much benefit to the Austrian Empire, and due to raw material problems, the domestic demand for many products is very tight, and using it to expand the market seems to be a bit outweighing the gains. This kind of false market share can be cleared by other powers with just a decree. Someone must be asking, isn't there a spirit of contract and free trade? But that can only be established when both parties agree. Otherwise the abandonment spirit will teach you to be yourself every minute point. If you want to be the world's factory like the British, it is not enough to rely on Austria's own industrial capabilities. After all, the British have not been deceived by the Jewish financial consortium to industrialize like the Americans of later generations. So Franz is still working on the 1/3 of an acre of land in his home, and there is also the unstable time bomb of Hungary that flashes out from time to time. Pro-Austrian nobles such as Zhnie and Prince Esterházy once again proposed building a railway to connect Hungary and Austria to participate in the national economy. However, as expected, they were once again characterized as traitors, and the proposal was also criticized and rejected. Of course, it was impossible for Kossuth to let all Hungary's agricultural products rot in the ground. Since the two roads of Germany and Italy were unavailable, he thought of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, Majid also wants to expand the market. After all, reform is very expensive, and where does the money come from? Naturally, it relies on trade and taxes, so you can't reduce your own expenses, right? But it is a pity that both countries are agricultural countries. The duplication rate of commodities is very high, and the transportation hub Belgrade is blocked by Austria. This kind of trade that was not worth the gain only lasted for a short period of time, and then declared bankruptcy August 10, 1842. Trieste, headquarters of the Austrian Imperial Navy. In a surprising move, Friedrich decided to sell 11 refitted second-level battleships to his former enemy, the Oman Empire. This may be the largest transaction in human naval history so far. Oman also sent Suwini, the heir to the Said dynasty, and Majid, Said's favorite son, which shows how seriously it attaches importance. Historically, it was after Said's death that they split the powerful empire established by their father, and finally both became colonies of the great powers. The reason why Said came to discuss this business was because he knew very well that the arrival of Britain and France would indeed increase Oman's income, but once the nature of weakness was discovered, it would be the two most terrifying reminders. Said was willing to pay any price to preserve the foundation he had created. But that also required the help of the great powers. It just so happened that Friedrich looked down upon the Egyptian battleships very much. Even after Austrian modifications, the firepower, defense, speed and other performance still could not meet his requirements. But battleships were huge weapons in the 19th century. Just getting a few of them could change the country's defense posture, and they could even be used to kill other countries on other continents. Therefore, who to sell to and how to deal with it became a big problem that troubled Friedrich. Fortunately, the successive visits from Britain and France stimulated Said's nerves and made him determined to strengthen his naval strength at all costs. Friedrich immediately found Franz. I'm going to sell all the second-class battleships captured from Egypt to the Omanis. What do you think? Friedrich's words were straight to the point, and Franz was used to it. There has always been a blank in the Austrian Imperial Navy. Among the generals in the Ministry of War, only Friedrich himself had a naval background, and the others could not help at all, let alone put forward useful opinions. With such a big deal, how can we fill the vacancies in the Austrian Imperial Navy? The empire now is different from the past. If the maritime power forms a vacuum, or is too weak, many people will make an issue about it, including U-by battleships Omanis. Friedrich had already thought about this, and he had been prepared for it. In addition to refitting Egyptian junk over the years, we have also built and launched 5 battleships ourselves, including my current flagship Venetia Point after the Turkish-Egyptian war ended. The Navy built another batch of warships, and 3 more are expected to be launched next year. Moreover, in terms of performance, our country's self-built battleships are far better than the Egyptians' garbage. Their shipbuilding level is not even as good as Napoleon. It seems that Friedrich really dislikes the Egyptian battleships, and given the current world situation, France feels that a war between Britain and France is more likely. Although there have always been conflicts between other countries, they are far from the time to resort to war. Strategically speaking, there is no problem in selling battleships to the Omanis. They pose no threat to us, but I feel that the number of the Navy is still seriously insufficient. Because I have reliable intelligence, the French and the British are launching a naval arms race. The French took great pains to maintain the Texas colony. They even approved the establishment of the Great Texas Naval Base, and the size of the fleet would be equal to the Grand Eastern Fleet, Mediterranean Fleet, and the Grand Occidental Fleet, Atlantic Fleet. At this time, the situation faced by the British was much more unfavorable than in history. The Austrian Imperial Navy suddenly rose. The Russian Navy has been expanding its arms and preparing for war. France is building a large fleet to enhance its maritime strength, and the Americans are also constantly challenging the British bottom line point. Although Britain is still technically confident of its ability to wipe out the combined navies of other powers, its power is too scattered, and the news that France will build 21 battleships at a time really touch the British's sensitive nerves. Chapter 353 Conflict escalates. The 21 battleships, Grand Texas Fleet, under construction by the French cannot satisfy France's ambitions. Whether it is Louis Philippe or the Bonapartist soldiers, they all feel that France deserves better. The Great Eastern Fleet Expansion Plan, the Great Western Fleet Expansion Plan, the New Paddle Steamer Plan, and the Great Texas Fleet Transformation Plan. A series of jaw-dropping big plans were put on the agenda. Point from the people to the top. All French people hope to build a powerful navy to wash away the shame brought by the British. Point in the face of this overwhelming hatred, Guizot could not do anything. He could only approve a large-scale shipbuilding plan. But now France needs money everywhere. It is true that the country is prosperous, but various expenses have also increased with it. Point at the same time, the corruption problem of Guizot's government began to surface. Before, corruption in French politics was no problem. It only faced small players such as Spain, Mexico, the United States, and the Central American Federation. Point. But at this time, we are facing the powerful Britain. Such a huge shipbuilding plan is inherently costly. If corruption continues as before, the cost will be an astronomical black hole. Point. But it is difficult to punish corruption, not to mention that he himself is the biggest behind the scenes. Domestic workers' strike uprising, lion worker strike, agricultural crisis, the Republicans who want to violently overthrow Louis Philippe, and the increasingly restless Bonapartist. If all these corrupt officials are really dealt with, who will be able to defend France? Francois Guizot comforted himself in his heart. South America, Viceroyalty of La Plata. Governor Rosas is still planning his great cause. If Argentina wants to unify South America, it must destroy Brazil. The first step to destroy Brazil is to control Uruguay. If it wants to win Uruguay, it must first conquer Montevideo. In this way only then can it cut off its support. Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, was also the most important port at the time and an important competitor of Buenos Aires. However, Rosas's men did not know the governor's ambitions. They felt that Rosas was too close to the Brazilians and had betrayed Buenos Aires. So Juan Manuel, the radicals headed by contacted the French, hoping to drive away Rosas, the British puppet. Of course, no one would say this directly. The reasons they gave were that Rosses was cruel and violent, killed innocent people indiscriminately, violated the principles of free trade, and was authoritarian and reactionary. In fact, they were not talking nonsense. Although Rosses was a republican, his reactionary level was far beyond that of ordinary emperors. In order to win over the church, Rosses restored church privileges and closed a large number of schools. When he took office, there were 114 schools in Argentina, but by the end of his rule, there were only 35 schools left in the country. Rosses also restored the Jesuit organization and used the power of the church to carry out deceptive propaganda and deceived many gauchos, blacks, and Indians into working for him. It's almost like believing in Rosses and going to heaven. This outrageous statement. People's education level was very low at that time, and scams that seem ridiculous now can often deceive many people. In the name of maintaining order, Rosses implemented a policy of terror. During his rule, more than 20,000 people in Argentina were killed, and their property was confiscated. You must know that the total population of Argentina at this time was only a few 100,000. His rule resulted in a mass exodus of the elite and the establishment of anti-Rosses organizations in other countries, which historically paved the way for his demise. But in this life, Rosses could no longer wait for that time. An expeditionary force consisting of 15 warships and 5,000 French soldiers was preparing to head to Buenos Aires to help justice. Originally, the regime change in Argentina had nothing to do with the British, because no matter who was in power, the money owed to the British must be repaid. However, London received a secret message that the French not only wanted to overthrow Rosses, but also established their own puppet regime, and then converted it into a French colony. This kind of thing was absolutely unacceptable to the British, so they sent someone to negotiate with the French. However, this arrogant British gentleman deeply hurt the fragile heart of the French. Because of the previous Spanish Civil War, the Turkish-Egyptian War, the Central American Federation Civil War, and the agency issue of Mombasa, the East African port, the British had to stab the French on the head every time. At the beginning of this expedition to the Viceroyalty of La Plata, the British followed them like hunting dogs that had smelled blood. This made the French almost intolerable, because the Viceroyalty of La Plata, Argentina, was originally a Spanish colony, and now all they have done is return the property to its original owner. So a French diplomat with a low official rank gave a stern reply to the British diplomat's aggressive questioning. The French expedition to La Plata was it was not an invasion, but a rescue operation to drive away thieves, robbers, and tyrants. I advise you, and the British government, if you are unwilling to contribute to saving your white compatriots, please at least don't confuse black and white and embarrass us. The irony contained in the French diplomat's words was self-evident. When had the British gentleman suffered such a big loss at that time? He immediately asked, "Why do you say that? Can you tell whether it is an invasion or not just by your words? And what right do you have to comment on the actions of our government?" The French official straightened his clothes, cleared his throat and said, "I will give you the same words. Can you judge whether our country is an invader based on just one sentence from you? And why do you have the right to make unreasonable comments about the actions of our government?" The two officials went back and forth and refused to give in to each other. Seeing that the atmosphere was getting more and more uncomfortable, other entourages from both sides separated the two. Since the two people arguing were relatively low level, the chief officials of both missions didn't pay much attention. After all, politics is not a trivial matter for quarreling with each other. In the eyes of those professional diplomats, there is nothing that cannot be discussed. Spain is Argentina's former suzerainty, and Britain is now the creditor of the Viceroyalty of La Plata. Both sides can take what they need, and even divide the country into two. It's not a big deal. Britain and France can make the Viceroyalty of La Plata independent from Spain, and they can naturally return it to Spain, or they can share half of it. In short, it is just a business that can be negotiated. As for Governor Rosses, it was a completely insignificant thing compared with the interests of Britain and France. However, the content of this quarrel soon appeared on the front page of London's The Times, and the editor-in-chief wrote a very inflammatory article about it, coupled with a photo of French officials showing their teeth and claws. And for a while the bars and cafes on the streets were full of talk of war with France. Similarly, people in Paris took to the streets to protest against the British interference in France and Spain's internal affairs. The angry crowd even threw torches and stones at the British embassy. The hotel where the British mission was staying was also besieged. In the end, the Paris police had to intervene to suppress it. Things calmed down. But the calls for war did not disappear. Although both sides are trying to get out of the way, Franz does not feel that Britain and France can start a war just because of this, so he needs to add more fire. Chapter 354 Britain will never back down. Gizzard had long been accustomed to facing the poverty and turmoil of the people. In his heart, only the bottom line of friendship between Britain and France was unchangeable. Just like the speech he gave when he took office early, we don't want to talk about conquests, wars, and revenge. Let France prosper, let it be free, rich, intelligent and carefree, and we will not regret that it has no influence on world events. The current path of colonial expansion was not actually designed by Gizzard. What he hoped was to develop France's own market potential in exchange for a stable external environment. However, the world as a whole, the Austrian Empire joined the German customs union, which greatly enhanced its competitiveness. This made France feel the crisis after the Spanish Civil War. Queen Regent Christiana made another offer that the French could not refuse. During the Battle of Texas, Gizzard saw the opportunity and won Texas, which the United States and Mexico had repeatedly fought for, at a very good price. It even squandered the remaining funds during the Mexican Civil War, saving France a large sum of money. The Texas colony brought a lot of resources to France, as well as quite good tax revenue. Moreover, the potential of this colony was huge, and it was fully expected to become the second France. Later, although it lost its exclusive interests in Egypt in the Turkish-Egyptian War for hegemony in the Near East, with the end of the Spanish Civil War, it could free up more power to start establishing colonies around the world. Invade Algeria, invade Morocco, compete with the Austrian Empire for West Africa, compete with the British for East Africa, carve up the Central American Federation, and jointly develop Asian colonies with Spain. Unknowingly, France has gone further and further down the road of colonialism, but this has indeed injected strong vitality into France at this time, allowing it to quickly recover from the economic crisis. But what Francois Gizzard was most concerned about was the Franco-Belgian customs union. Although Belgium had just become independent from the Netherlands for more than 10 years at this time, it was the country with the second fastest economic growth in Europe. Every year the growth rate exceeds 20%. The first is Luxembourg, but it is too small and has little reference value. Gizzard hoped that through concessions, Britain could accept the Franco-Belgian customs union to counter the increasingly powerful German customs union. If it is possible for Britain to make concessions on the Argentine issue, then there is no way to talk about the Low Countries. The Low Countries refer to the Netherlands, that is, the Netherlands and Belgium. Britain will resolutely fight back against any behavior that may threaten the British mainland or undermine its glorious independent status, and this time is no exception. As soon as the British cabinet received the news, they reached an internal consensus that the Franco-Belgian customs union must not be allowed to be established, because if he is allowed to run wild, it will not only resurrect Napoleon's ghost, but also directly threaten Britain's core interests. Palmerston still directly clamored for war as usual. Although the British have been memorizing words recently, they are undoubtedly the most powerful country in the world at this time. The Battle of Kabul, the Battle of Pangang Lake, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and the successive disastrous defeats forced the United Kingdom to mobilize troops from the mainland to fill the vacancy in Southeast Asia's military strength. At this time, the North Sea Fleet and the British mainland's defense forces were relatively weak, and what was even more terrible was the domestic workers' movement, also known as the Chartist movement. Britain was the earliest to industrialize, had the largest number of workers, and was the strongest. Although Queen Victoria, who had just ascended the throne, used her charisma to resolve the crisis, due to objective factors, the promise made by the Queen could not be fulfilled at all. As a result, workers were once again organized to seek their own rights. This time Victoria simply gave up her job. As she grew older, she became tired of those stupid and duplicitous politicians. At the same time, the queen also met the love of her life, Prince Albert, and the two preferred to enjoy the good time together instead of dealing with cumbersome national affairs. In fact, both of them have certain political skills, but unfortunately the British system and the politicians in power at the time were indeed strong, so they could only choose to settle for the second best point. The complex situation and huge pressure at home and abroad almost overwhelmed the cabinet members. Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne had to convene Congress to bring its proposal to Congress for a vote. Fortunately, all parties in the UK were surprisingly unanimous on the Franco-Belgian customs union and unanimously opposed France's establishment of a legal currency customs union. It's just that serious differences arose on the issue of the Viceroyalty of La Plata. Most congressmen opposed the threat of force on this matter because Britain had too many enemies, including Russia, France, Austria, the ancient empires in the east, and the savage native tribes of Oceania and Africa. The reason why most people opposed it was that Russia was the biggest threat to Britain's world hegemony, but Palmerston didn't think so. Gentlemen, please be quiet. Russia is a potential huge threat to Britain. They will threaten the Near East, threaten Central Asia, and may even occupy Afghanistan, cross the Hindu Kush mountains, and invade our India. But, gentlemen, please believe me, no one in the world understands Russia better than me. They have no outlet yet, which means they cannot pose a real threat to us. Palmerston's words hit the mark every time, and he is worthy of being the man who knows Russia best. But lawmakers will not agree to use force against France just because Russia poses a small threat, he said immediately. But the French have already gone to sea. They want to compete with us for North America, for Africa, for India, for Central America. Now they have to compete with us for South America. Faced with such an opponent who wants to compete with us for the world, what choice should the British Empire make? Back down? My answer is never, never, never. Never. The English context actually makes sense. Palmerston's words ignited the passion of the MPs, and there was only one voice in Parliament at this time. The British Empire will never back down. Of course, given the communication conditions at the time, a series of events would occur within a few months. Britain dispatched the main force of the West African Fleet to support South America, and brought 6,000 British soldiers with it. However, it was not to attack the French army, but to protect the legal property of the expatriates and the British. After all, most of the leaders of both sides had experienced the Napoleonic War, and understood the brutality of the war and its terrible destructive power, and they are all old yinbi, waiting for the other party to come to negotiate terms with them. At this time, the Spanish sky was once again shrouded in the clouds of civil war. Although Queen Regent Christiana had been deprived of most of her rights by the French, she was still not a peaceful person. Queen Regent Christiana was a very extravagant and lustful woman. Although she gave up her rights, she would not give up the opportunity for material enjoyment. On the one hand, Christiana sought out a large number of young and beautiful men and bought gold, silver and jewelry for her own enjoyment. On the other hand, she borrowed heavily in the name of her daughter and the royal family, but she was unable to repay, and did not want to repay. Chapter 355. Cooperation will benefit both parties, while fighting will cause both parties to lose. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was very willing to see the confrontation between Britain and France. After all, when a cannon is fired, gold is worth 10,000 taels, and middlemen and dealers are the most profitable. If you don't believe it, you can read the history of the United States. In order to bring Britain and France to the situation they are in today, France spent a lot of effort and a lot of financial resources, but most of it was just to create discord between Britain and France, making it impossible for the two sides to easily reach cooperation. After all, Britain was too powerful at this time, and had gained many fans around the world, causing high-level officials in many countries to be pro-British. This exaggerated political influence gave Franz a headache. For this reason, he had to weaken his influence, otherwise there would be no need to fight at all. As soon as Britain came to the negotiating table, it had a 5-point chance of winning. How could it be fun? For this reason, this war must be fought, otherwise Britain and France will discover an objective law, that is, as long as they reach an agreement, they can carve up the world point. At this time, the United States was still too far away from its era, Russia was still trapped in the bathtub of the Black Sea, and Prussia's navy was like a toy point. Although the Portuguese and Dutch navies started early, their upper limit is too low and they are already in decline. As for the population and location limitations of the Kingdom of Sweden, it can only be a theoretical power. The Ottoman Empire navy was once the overlord in the Near East, but after two heavy losses, it has fallen into decline. Its philosophy is even more behind the times. It is one of the few countries that continues to develop sailing battleships in this era. The Austrian Empire had money, technology, and naval warfare experts at this time, but the Adriatic Sea limited its upper limit very low. At this time, the British Mediterranean fleet could block it at any time if it wanted to, and the rest was just the question of cost point. In order to avoid this situation of two divided worlds, France had to think intensively about how to break them up. Although there has never been a situation in history where Britain and France carve up the world in terms of objective strength at this time, they do have this strength point: divide the world. It sounds ridiculous and absurd, but in fact, as early as 1493, Spain and Portugal successively formulated the papal meridian under the witness of the Pope, and signed the Treaty of Tordesillas and the Treaty of Zaragoza. The two teeth successfully divided the world point, although they all eventually declined, and the agreement to carve up the world became invalid. They also proved that carving up the world was not impossible. Colonization and industry are the two major themes of this era. If Austria gives up its overseas route, the ending and upper limit will not be much better than the historical allies. Buenos Aires, Governor's Palace. The warm morning sun shines lazily on people. Buenos Aires, the most developed city in the Viceroyalty of La Plata, now lacks some fireworks. Juan Manuel raised the banner against Rosas, the current president. Juan Manuel was very popular in southern Argentina. In addition, Rosas's cruel rule had long made others heartbroken. Rebellions soon broke out in some northern provinces. In addition to the 7 southern provinces, Argentina has a total of 24 provinces, but the population at that time was mainly concentrated in the southeastern coastal provinces. Rosas first sent a force of 2,000 men to try to defeat the rebels. However, due to long-term lack of military pay, the sent troops defected on the battlefield. Then, Rosas fell into chaos. He issued many contradictory orders in succession. On the one hand, he ordered the army besieging Montevideo to resolve the war within a week, and on the other hand, he required them to resolve the war within 3 days. He returned to Buenos Aires, and at the same time, sent a letter of request for help to Uruguay, asking the other party to help him put down the rebellion. Rosas also sent letters for help to many countries. In addition to Britain and France, it even included Spain, former sovereign country, Brazil, sworn enemy, the United States, Mexico and other countries. Even Austria received his letter for help. In the city of Buenos Aires, orbit trees flutter in the wind, and the blooming peach blossoms and orange capoc complement each other. The city's residents were gathered into the square, and the crowd was silent as this was the 5th group of people to be hanged by Rosas in 3 days. At first it was some political prisoners and bandits, then the rebels' family members and relatives, and then the rebels' friends, neighbors, colleagues, and partners were also hanged. In the end, anyone with the same name or surname as the rebels was hanged. After catching up with the gallows, the people who are going to be hanged now are the people who Rosas thinks may be traitors. Some people must have doubts about how such a cruel ruler could have soldiers working for him. After all, his life could be lost if he is not careful. But in fact, Rosas treated his firing squad very well, and these people had complete immunity in Argentina. At the same time, any questioning of the leader's orders would be regarded as betrayal, and would end up with the same fate as traitors. So naturally there will be a lot of people willing to sacrifice their lives for Rosas. The square is filled with gallows, and groups of people are hanged. Everyone in the audience is silent, for fear of looking into the eyes of this terrifying ruler. The remains of the deceased were randomly thrown together, then burned in the fire, and floated outside the city along with the capoc in the temporary command post of the rebels outside the city. The 18th Root Rebel King was discussing the issue of dividing the spoils. After defeating Rosas, some people planned to celebrate after entering the city for 7 days. Some people thought that the city should be slaughtered first to prevent Rosses from making a comeback. Some people proposed restoring the monarchy and inviting a king from Europe. Some people advocated inviting Saint Martin back from Paris to take charge of the overall situation. Of course, there are also people who want to be kings or presidents, but at this time the rebels always lack an absolutely powerful force, that is, they do not have a political or military strongman, so they started quarreling before they entered the city. At the same time, the French army and the British army met off the coast of Buenos Aires. The two sides did not fight, but just showed off their muscles a few kilometers apart. In the end, the French army landed in St. Matthias Bay. They chose to avoid a head-on conflict with the British Royal Navy. The generals on both sides were not crazy. They knew what would happen if a war started. Soldiers may not be afraid of death, but no one wants to die. The fishermen in St. Matthias Bay looked at the well-equipped French troops and either fled desperately or hid in their homes and knelt down to pray. This made the French officers and soldiers who called themselves liberators feel very hurt. The French official explanation of this war was to rescue the people of the Viceroyalty of La Plata and return them to its true owner, Spain. Rosses has been in power for more than 10 years, and he once forced French expatriates to death. His misdeeds are so bad that there is no need to spread rumors against such a person. The French soldiers certainly feel that they are the just party. At the same time, France and Spain are both under the rule of the Bourbon dynasty, and King Louis Philippe's youngest son Antoine will marry Queen Isabel II of Spain, so the French still have a high degree of recognition of this war. However, the French officers and soldiers were still very hurt by the confusion of local civilians counting French reinforcement. Outside Buenos Aires, the total strength of the rebels has reached 13,000. Rosses's strength was only 9,000 men, but there was a British expeditionary force of 3,000 men at the port. Chapter 356 Mao Zedong's suggestion. Franz wanted to see a big fireworks, and he even bribed Swiss artillery hired by the rebels to fire at the area where the British expeditionary force was stationed. But things did not go as smoothly as Franz thought. Even with the French presence, the interests within the rebels could not be reached. As a result, the war turned into a sit-in, and months of watching inside and outside the city began. The rebel lines began to loosen, because everyone had to go back to shearing sheep and doing production. The city was also in a state of chaos due to the siege by the rebels. He could only obtain supplies from the sea, but these all cost money. Buenos Aires did not have that much money for him to waste, so Rosses could only continue to borrow money from the British. At the same time, he also wanted to use British mediation to drive the French back to Europe. After all, during the crisis of 1838, the British intervened to stop the French siege of Buenos Aires. Rosses wanted to repeat his old tricks, but the British ambassador seemed worried at this time, because he had received domestic news that the French came with bad intentions this time, and he must carefully handle the relationship with France. If necessary, he could fight with the French army, but the parties involved must take full responsibility. Such ambiguous instructions made neither the British ambassador in Buenos Aires, John Stevenson, nor Army Brigadier General Buckmund want to take on the responsibility. After all, the officials in Whitehall, the name for the London government, neither have to charge into battle nor bear the responsibility for defeat. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Helmut in the Turkish-Egyptian War, George Eden in the Afghan War, and Colonel Zuli in the Battle of Pangang Lake all became scapegoats in the end. Gambling one's own future and life with the French is really not worth the gain. No matter how fanciful the people sent by Palmerston say, this British expeditionary force is unmoved. Austria Vienna. The cotton planted by the Russians was mature. So Nicholas I was very confident in his cotton. He felt that it would definitely bring good profits to Russia, because at this time, Russia exported too few profitable commodities. But Russian officials were worried. After all, the quality of Russian cotton was not very good, and at this time Austria had imported a large amount of cotton from the United States, and African colonies were also contributing cotton to their mother country. This makes Russian officials feel that their cotton is not competitive at all. If the Austrians reject Russian cotton, then the Russians will need to develop their own textile industry to consume the cotton, and their textile industry is still stuck in the 18th century. In fact, what Russian officials were worried about did not happen. The Austrians did not take the opportunity to lower prices, nor were they picky. Just grading cotton, weighing it, and counting the money. Half was paid in cash and half in finished fabric, which the Russians thought was fair. Because Russia needs to import a large amount of finished fabrics from Europe almost every year, and the price of the fabrics used by the Austrian Empire as collateral for goods is obviously lower than the price they import, which saves them a lot of money. In fact, Austria has also proposed that the finished fabrics can be exchanged for Austrian expected banknotes of equivalent value. Of course, Austrian expected banknotes can only purchase goods in Austria. Tsar Nicholas I was also very satisfied with this approach. Although he preferred to change everything into money, he still felt that he had taken a big advantage when the Minister of Finance said that the price of cloth paid by the Austrian Empire was lower than the market price. Moreover, with the money earned from Austria, Russia can develop its own industry and navy, but in fact the money is still a drop in the bucket. But the Tsar couldn't control that much, because Russia was too poor. And industrialization and military development were inseparable from the support of money. How much land do we have left to grow cotton? Asked the Tsar. We had planted 300,000 acres, and there are about 6 million acres of land available for development. The newly appointed agriculture minister Sergei Sharabin said with trepidation that after all, his predecessor was planted on the top of the highest peak of the Ural Mountains by the Tsar. He did not want to accidentally offend His Majesty the Tsar and become a potted plant with those words. Change them all into cotton. My army needs money. We can use this cotton to exchange with the Austrians for what we need. The future of the Third Rome lies on these little white flowers. Can you do it? Thanks Sergei Sharabin. As soon as Sergei Sharabin raised his head, he was so frightened that he knelt down, because at some point, Nicholas I, who was 206 centimeters tall, was already standing in front of him. This burly and fierce-looking Tsar had personally ordered the execution of many self-righteous overlords and pretentious revolutionaries. Sergei Sharabin seemed to see a scarlet army of dead souls surrounding him. Sergei Sharabin rubbed his eyes and slammed his head on the ground. Yes, Your Majesty the Tsar. Ula, Your Majesty the Tsar. Hurrah. The surrounding court officials also echoed. Tsar Nicholas I was very satisfied with this result. He felt that he was one step closer to Constantinople. Vienna. In fact, the amount of cotton sent by the Russians was far less than Franz expected. The Austrian factories might not be able to last even a week at full operation. But in order to keep Prussia as its ally under close control, Austria had to import Russian cotton. After all, no treaty can explain the problem better than naked interests. What Franz didn't know was that because of the cotton problem, Russia was more eager for Ottoman and Central Asian lands than ever before. The Russians actually have their own shipbuilding plan, but due to financial constraints, they are only maintaining and adjusting the existing Black Sea fleet, such as retiring outdated battleships and building sailing battleships to replace them. Although the Russians had realized the superior performance of steamships at this time, they had no plans to build them. Historically, Russian steam battleships began to be built only after the 1860s, and the first steam battleship was launched in 1864. Although Russia has lived deep in the mainland for a long time, it is very interested in what is happening in the world, such as the discord between Britain and France in Argentina. How could Nasser love, the leader of the pro-British faction, miss this opportunity to show his British soul to the British? As a result, Russia sent a note to the great powers, hoping that all countries could jointly discuss the issue of the La Plata colony. In fact, everyone knows that this matter has nothing to do with Russia, but at this time, neither the United Kingdom nor France dare to ignore the opinions of this European military policeman. After all, most of the senior people in the two countries still hope for peace. The one who can solve this crisis, and Russia's strength is enough to shake the balance of victory and defeat. As for Austria and Prussia, two Melanitas, they have no reason to refuse Russia's invitation in the spirit of participation. Because Russia is too close to Germany and Austria, both sides need to win over this behemoth, whether it is to unify Germany or to maintain the status quo of the German Confederation. The Russian approach is still so simple, efficient, popular and easy to understand. International condominium. Nassolov shouted, slamming the table. Chapter 357. The First St. Petersburg Conference. Russia, St. Petersburg. Nasserlov's voice shocked the Prussian ambassador Heinrich von Bülow to the point where he almost choked. Fortunately, the personnel of the Prussian mission were experienced. After all, the two foreign ministers did not often speak at international meetings before, so eating and drinking became another kind of entertainment. On the other side, what new ideas did Prince Metternich think the Russians would have? I didn't expect that it was just jealousy and envy. The ocean powers were carving up the land everywhere, and the furry bears on the land could only look at each other across the sea, so they would naturally feel resentful. Although the Russian proposal was also beneficial to Austria on the surface, Metternich did not believe that there would be any free lunch, and he decided to wait and see. Ever since, the Austrian mission also started a fishing trip like the Prussian mission. After all, it is impossible to let people eat something without paying a price. On the other hand, the Austrian Empire currently does not have enough strength and funds to continue developing new colonies. Metternich admitted that the resources of the Aplati colony were very rich, but compared with the cost of maintaining a colony at the southernmost tip of South America, it seemed that the gains were not worth the loss. Franz is also not very optimistic about South America. Whether it is Brazil or Argentina, population and population quality are big problems. The situation in South America is different from that in Africa. Although black Africans have low educational levels, their population is sufficient and there is no shortage of labor force. But the situation in South America is different. Although whites and mixed-race whites are the majority, their educational level is not much better than that of Africans, and they lack sufficient labor force. They also inherited the white people's tendency to make trouble and rebel at every turn. In short, it means that there are too few people and poor quality. But Russia doesn't care about that much, as long as it's land, they like it. The Russian approach was immediately rejected by Palmerston. Mr. Nasserlov, I think you could put it more tactfully, please. Tell me. Nasserlov himself was a soldier. He didn't know much about diplomatic etiquette, let alone Palmerston's seemingly harmless words. You should say this: we in Russia want it there. Argentina should give us a share. Palmerston was as pungent and merciless as ever, but this time his self-righteous British humor did not amuse everyone. Prussia and Austria were just here to watch the fun, and they both sought help from Russia, so naturally they could not agree with Britain. Sweden, the Northern Lion, is actually a helper invited by the Russians, so it is impossible to laugh at the Russians. Although Francois Guizot was in power in France, in order to prevent him from betraying the country, Bonapartists and radicals opposed allowing Guizot and his cronies to participate in the negotiations. Finally, the French elected a young man named Pierre, who was both an aristocrat and a royalist, but at the same time, opposed Guizot's governing philosophy. Such a maverick young man would naturally not give Palmerston face. On the contrary, as a colonialist, he felt that it was more in the interest of France to have good relations with Russia. After all, Russia and France have no direct conflict of interest, and Britain is their common enemy. At this time, they can completely use the power of the Russians to gain a first mover advantage in this crisis. Mr. Palmerston, this is a naked slander. Lord Nasserlov proposed international condominium, not monopoly or partition. This also means that His Majesty the Tsar of Russia wants to resolve this crisis in a peaceful way, but you are trying to judge a gentleman with a villain's heart, and are afraid that the world will not be in chaos. Pierre gave Palmerston a big pat as soon as he came up, and put the international condominium plan in the name of the Tsar. Moreover, the so-called international condominium was originally proposed by the Russians themselves, and this time it was added in the name of the Tsar, so they were even less able to veto the proposal. Palmerston did not get angry and argue with Pierre as expected. Instead, he chose to ignore the French ambassador's words and continued to ask Nasserlov, how does Russia plan to govern internationally? His Majesty's proposal is that the three countries of the Holy Alliance, plus Britain, France, the Kingdom of Sweden, and Spain, should jointly govern the Viceroyalty of La Plata to ensure its freedom, security, and prosperity. Nasserlov's speech was written by someone else, and it was very inconsistent with his language style. However, it was personally requested by His Majesty the Tsar, and he did not dare to complain. In fact, the core of Russia is that the Viceroyalty of La Plata cannot belong to any one country. Its income requires the above mentioned 6 countries. This is also the necessary fund to ensure its security and freedom. To put it simply, the Russians want to have nothing to lose. This approach can be said to be very hairy. Pooh and Austria neither opposed nor agreed and continued to eat melon. In fact, everyone wanted to take advantage of it, but Palmerston was too strong and unyielding. Neither Metternich nor Heinrich von Bülow wanted to make themselves embarrassed. Of course, they will not give up their free income easily. Once they see an opportunity, they will swarm it like wolves. After France formed an alliance and marriage with Spain, they all felt that they were just getting back what belonged to them. Both the British and the Russians were just obstacles to them. But Count Pierre felt that, now that he was on the negotiating table, he should seek a more favorable condition for France. Palmerston, on the other hand, was still unyielding. He was used to driving his opponents into corners and finally had to agree to his conditions. Why? Does Russia just rely on the 600,000 infantrymen on the southern Russian steppes? Do you know how long the voyage is from Sevastopol to Buenos Aires? How much does it cost? Do you understand? Nasserlov actually knew nothing about the situation in Argentina. He only knew that apart from the United Kingdom, Russia had no rivals in Europe. At this time, he was actually speechless when asked. Metternich couldn't stand it anymore. How could the Russian foreign minister be such a waste? In fact, this was all the fault of Tsar Nicholas I due to the rebellion in the Senate. When he ascended the throne, he extremely distrusted civilian officials. As a result, almost all the ministers in the Russian Central Committee were military officers. They may be very loyal to the Tsar personally, but they are really a mess in the affairs they are responsible for, and the corruption style is no less than that of France. At this time, Count Pierre suddenly spoke. Mais La Plata needs 600,000 troops? Could it be that the tyrant Rossis is backed by you, the British? Palmerston was not afraid of the threat of war, but he could not let France gain the upper hand in public opinion and immediately retorted, "Sir, Rossis is a decent gentleman. You French sent troops to invade a peace-loving country. Who is the tyrant?" At that time, Europeans did not know much about Argentina and Rossis, so after Palmerston said a few words casually, the entire public opinion situation began to reverse again, and everyone condemned the French invasion. After all, France did many such things during the Napoleonic Wars. Rossis is a beast and a gentleman. Shouldn't you, the British, know better? We in France support the international condominium proposed by Russia. In fact, Count Pierre was already prepared. Although the outcome of this negotiation will not depend on whether Rossis is a tyrant, proving his brutal nature is still beneficial to France. Count Pierre's support for international condominium actually had his own plan, which was to first find a way to get rid of the dog Rossis raised by the British, and then find a way to support a dog of his own. Rossis's nonsense was soon made public. Although he was not a heinous tyrant in South America, he was still unique in Europe, which had been at peace for several years. He was almost as good as Nero and Cyprus. The ancient tyrants such as Ryugu II were compared. In fact, the French had already done a good job in public opinion work when they sent troops for expeditions, but these efforts were selectively ignored by various countries because the French only carried out propaganda in their own 1/3 of an acre. If Franz had not been, I'm afraid that, if he helps in secret, he will be fooled by Palmerston. The French were very proud at this time. They felt that Paris was the center of the world. At this time, the British's intelligence work was also very poor. Even at the negotiating table, Palmerston felt that Rossis was a good person. Of course, whether Rossis is a good person or not, Britain's position will not change. This is not important at all. What is important is that it allows the French to take the upper hand. The status of the French was suddenly elevated from invader to savior. Britain's only support at this time was the debt problem. This role was not glorious. Palmerston was angry at Count Pierre's cheesing, but the best choice for Britain at this time was to privately carve up Argentina with France, rather than engage in international condominium. But first he had to push the Russians out of the way before he could sit down and talk slowly with the French. Since the Viceroyalty of La Plata can adopt the method of international condominium, why can't the straight issue be solved? In this way, the straits refer to the Bosporus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait, which are related to the survival of the Black Sea Fleet. Palmerston's retelling of the old story was to make the Russians get into trouble, because the straits issue was indeed a major matter related to the rise and fall of the country and the world's political situation, and Nasrallah couldn't make up his mind at all. In fact, as far as Nasrallah personally is concerned, as well as many pro-British factions in Russia, they feel that the strait issue should give up the convenient conditions brought by the Winkerai-Scalisi Treaty and accept the British proposal. Put the Black Sea Straits under international condominium management. However, due to Franz's influence, Tsar Nicholas I became a staunch opponent, so the strait issue between Britain and Russia has been shelved. The British tried several times to cancel the Russians' privileges in the Black Sea Straits, but Nicholas I vetoed them. At this time, the British once again raised the issue of the straits, precisely because they wanted to use their own spears to attack their own shields and make the Russians contradict themselves, or choose to give up the convenient conditions brought by the Winkerai-Scalisi Treaty and move the Black Sea Strait, hand it over to international condominium, or withdraw from the fight for Argentina and let Britain and France continue to carve up the world. Whatever happens, Palmerston is very happy to see it. But he overlooks something. Metternich, the old fox, was still there. Sorry, did you mean the English Channel? The diplomats present were not stupid and naturally understood the meaning, so they all laughed in cooperation. Mr. Metternich, you know where I mean it, said Palmerston, frowning. Where? Metternich continued to pretend to be confused. Of course it's the Black Sea Strait. Palmerston snorted coldly. Then, why can't it be the English Channel? Metternich continued to ask like a stubborn old man. The English Channel is the door to our UK. Who would hand over their own door to someone else's jurisdiction? Palmerston replied impatiently. Then, the Black Sea is not Russia's gateway to the ocean? Metternich asked rhetorically. But the Black Sea Strait belongs to the Ottoman Empire. Palmerston immediately retorted. Ah, they're not France, Belgium, and the Netherlands across the English Channel? Metternich asked again. Although Nasrallah was not good at talking, he still had the ability to praise and cheer. Metternich took the lead in applauding as soon as he finished speaking, completely giving Palmerston no chance to continue to refute. At this time, Count Pierrel stood up again and reiterated that France was willing to accept the transfer of the La Plata colony to international condominium management. Although Palmerston knew that France would never easily give up the opportunity to monopolize Argentina, he did not dare to gamble, because once it became an international condominium, not to mention that Britain would not be able to collect its debts, and the economic colonization strategy would be declared bankrupt. The final outcome was a word of drag. Palmerston refused to sign the agreement, and the issue of ownership of the La Plata colony naturally could not be resolved. In fact, except for Britain and France, other countries are not anxious about this matter at all. After all, the benefits of pie in the sky are the best, and it doesn't matter if they don't. Count Pierrel approached Nasrallah after the meeting and told the latter that if the condominium agreement came into effect, France could help manage the La Plata colony for Russia. Afterwards, representatives of Prussia, Austria, and Sweden were naturally found. Of course, these countries knew what the French were planning, which was to exchange money for political power. There is no loss for all countries, so there will naturally be no objections. Palmerston also found representatives from various countries after Count Pierrel, but he had no actual expression. He was just playing his own tricks, accusing the French of being invaders and wanting to relive the Napoleonic era. Old dream, promoting the French threat theory. Then he began to threaten various countries, saying that the British Navy was invincible. What would happen if the Black Sea was blocked? What would happen if the Strait of Gibraltar, the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea, was blocked? And what would happen if the North Sea was blocked? In the end, they tried to win over each other, saying that Britain must be the final winner, and it was still too late to get on board. Of course, Palmerston is a master among them, and can easily find the pain points of various countries. For example, he promised to Metternich that he would give several French West African colonies, including Guinea, to the Austrian Empire, so that they could be connected with Austria's original Ivory Coast colony, to form a larger colony that would be easier to develop and manage. Austria really needs this colony. If this can be realized, an Austrian West Africa can be created, which will undoubtedly be a boost for the future development of the empire. But after rational analysis, you will find that Palmerston is completely generous to others. Those lands originally belonged to the French. If the Austrian Empire really participated in the war and took these lands as its own, then it would be Austria who paid the price for taking the lands, and it would be Austria that would bear the wrath of France in the future. This seems to be no different from going to war with the French and directly grabbing their territory. It happened again and again. This Cold was really a bit endless. This is the current state for the time being. And I will update it in a few days, when things get better. That's it. All book friends, please take care of yourself. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 358, The Beginning of Famine. USA, Ohio. A strange odor emitted from a box of grain attracted the attention of a stevedore. When he opened the box with a crowbar, he found a pile of soft and brown potatoes in the hay. The worker immediately realized the seriousness of the matter. Because this virus is contagious, not only the potatoes that have come into contact with this box of goods will rot, but even the potatoes in the entire Ohio may not be spared. But the employer obviously didn't care about this, and even teased him in return. Oh, Stephen. Do you think you're a state representative? You're just a fucking stevedore now, Bobby. That's not what I'm talking about today. What I want to tell you is that you must burn all grains, not just potatoes. Otherwise this disease will sweep across Ohio like the Black Death. You can't transport it away. Wherever this germ passes, no grass will grow. Bobby. Stark had a look of disgust on his greasy face. Is this what you want to say? Who will compensate for my losses? Or am I going to destroy my career and live on the streets like you? I don't have that. You are such a good friend. You can take me in and provide me with food and clothing. So now you can turn against me. You can apply for federal compensation. Steven Sippel's words are very unconfident because he knows that it is extremely difficult to obtain federal compensation through this kind of thing. And even if there is compensation, the amount will be far less than the loss. Damn it. You might as well pray to God to rid the world of this damn mold forever. I don't want to hear your scaremongering here. Listen, Steven, there's $5 on the table. Take it and shut up and move on. Be your stevedore, or get out of here. Your choice, Bobby. Stark was completely disappointed with his friend. He was clearly blessed by his ancestors, and was born with a silver spoon in his heart. However, he ended up on the wrong team every time, and now he can only live by selling coolies. It seems that people really shouldn't read too many books, otherwise they will become stupid. Bobby Stark came to this conclusion. Products from Bobby's farm traveled down the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal to Washington, D.C., where they awaited shipment to ships across the ocean to Island Point. In fact, Steven Sippel was not an alarmist. Potato late blight has been known as a devastating disease to this day. Infection with late blight can lead to widespread death of potatoes or a sharp reduction in yields, and this mold can not only be spread through contact, but can also be spread through water and air, as long as the temperature and humidity are appropriate. Usually, as long as crops infected with potato late blight are found in one area, the entire area will soon be infected. Of course, the degree of disaster will vary depending on the local temperature, humidity, and crop varieties. A favorite disease of potato late blight is in rainy, cold and humid climates, such as the United Kingdom and Ireland. Queen's Village, Southern Ireland. Scathach Jennings is 12 years old. Although she has the same name as the ancient Irish hero, she can neither use magic nor use a spear. If there is something special about her compared to ordinary people, it is that she can read and write. Yes, in this era of Ireland, as a Catholic, her ability to read and write was indeed an incredible skill point, because the British started a colonial plan many centuries ago, confiscating the property of the indigenous people of Ireland, and planning to build a large number of plantations, just like the Anglo-Saxons did in North America. The fate of the Irish should have been the same as that of the Indians in North America and the indigenous people of New Zealand and Australia. But fortunately, they chose to fight and received support from powerful countries on the European continent. Spain and France both tried to land on the island of Ireland. For this reason, the blood of the Irish did not stop even during the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was a non-violent coup launched by the British bourgeoisie and the new aristocracy in 1688 to overthrow the rule of James II and prevent the restoration of Catholicism. There was no bloodshed in this revolution, so historians call it the Glorious Revolution, but in fact Cromwell personally conquered Ireland, and the bodies piled up in Wexford alone were 5 meters high. Yes, it was about building landscapes, but 1688 was no longer the Middle Ages. At this time, the British had already defined themselves as a model for the civilized world. The Irish nobles were the first to surrender to the British. In order to be accepted by the British, they put on British clothes and British lifestyles, abandoned Catholicism, believed in the Anglican Church, spoke English, and were appointed by the British to manage poor Ireland. Aboriginal people. But the British would not let them go. The method they chose to colonize Ireland was very primitive. They first chose the tweening order of the Han dynasty. After the death of a local Irish noble, the land will be equally distributed to all sons, ensuring that there will be no big landowners on the island of Ireland. But even though he was shameless at this time, he still did bad things in the name of fairness. Soon the British found a new excuse, that is, the Irish were as Catholic as the Spanish, so they considered the Irish collaborators as a result, the British government began to openly massacre the Irish and confiscate their property. Then they took the opportunity to enact a series of punitive laws. For example, Irish people are not allowed to own horses or donkeys, are not allowed to go to school, vote in elections, become public officials, own land, or own property exceeding £15, etc. Some of these laws were still in place even before Irish independence. Later, during the Napoleonic era, the British defined the Irish as allies of the French and repeated the same trick. However, the interesting thing is that every time the British raised the butcher's knife, the Irish had not yet begun to call for help from their allies, and their allies did not notice this. There is a passage on January 23, 1799, when British Prime Minister William Pitt commented on Ireland is possessed by an evil spirit. This evil spirit is deeply rooted in this people, including their moral character, manners, and habits, as well as their intellectual deficiencies, barbarism, ignorance, and backwardness. Their religion and their hostility to the civilized world gave birth to a prejudice against the world, and allowed superstition and cruelty to take root. To put it simply, the British did not regard the Irish as their countrymen, or even as white people, but as black people, Indians, or whatever. Historically, in 1829, Daniel O'Connell finally qualified the Irish to receive education through several generations of hard work. Of course, it was not an ordinary school, but a school specially established for Irish Catholics, to prevent the English from contracting the plague of poverty and laziness. But in fact, there are not many poor Irish people who can receive education on the island of Ireland, and Scathach Jennings is one of them, thanks to the fact that there is a priest living near her home. At that time, Irish Catholics lived a miserable life, but these clergymen were not as miserable as they imagined. Although not as good as their counterparts in Europe, they can be said to be doing very well compared to ordinary Irish people. But pure religious education also has great disadvantages. That is, the local people's knowledge level is as high as that of the Middle Ages. What we call common sense seems so noble or deviant in their eyes. Scathach Jennings has an older brother, 2 younger brothers, and 2 younger sisters. Her family has 2 rooms, and a covered cabin is where her parents live, while the 6 of them live in one house, in a roofless adobe house. I haven't found out the specific reason for this, but at that time, roofed houses were more advanced than roofless adobe houses. There was only 1 bed in the room, but Scathach never worried about it collapsing, because it was made of stone, and covered with dried hay, but it had no bedspread. Scathach's family farms 10 acres. 60 acres, which is much better off than most of their fellow Irishmen. Since the Irish could not own their own land, landowners rented it to them in small plots, often with only 3 to 4 acres for a family to survive. Some people may think that 3 to 4 acres is not too much, but the productivity of land at that time was far inferior to modern times. Grandpa Ewan is immortal. Moreover, landowners in Europe at that time were generally more ruthless than those in Asia. It was basically routine to take away 60% of the income operate. In addition, Scathach's family also has 3 pigs, an old dog, and 5 chickens, including an egg-laying hen. This is the entire property of Scathach's family. Their family eats potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, and potatoes for dinner. However, they will not eat baked potatoes, fried potatoes, sauced potatoes, cold potatoes, or shredded potatoes, potato chips, and mashed potatoes. In fact, the Irish at that time usually only had one way to eat potatoes, which was to cook them, and eat them directly with some salt. It is this monotonous food that feeds nearly 8.3 million people on the island of Ireland. Just imagine what a horrific scene it would be if something went wrong with this food one day. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Archbishop Rocher didn't quite understand what Franz meant, including sending Austrian priests to the island of Ireland. He felt that if he wanted the church to help collect intelligence, he should disguise himself as an Anglican member and go to a big city like London or Portsmouth City. As for Ireland as a whole, cities including Dublin don't seem to be very important. Archduke Franz, if Ireland doesn't want to eat potatoes, maybe they can choose to grow wheat, corn, sweet potatoes, rice and the like. Cassava is also a very good choice. Archduke Franz's cassava cultivation in Namibia was very successful. When the local indigenous people saw that our people ate cassava without any discomfort, they believed that our gods were stronger than their gods, and the number of believers grew rapidly. Several major local tribes have converted to the church, and the total number of people has increased from 200 to 100,000 now. It is obvious that Archbishop Rocher is also not concerned about the life and death of the Irish. In contrast, he is more interested in the new indigenous believers in Namibia. Archbishop, the land on the island of Ireland is very tight. If we don't grow potatoes, we probably won't be able to feed so many people. Archduke Franz, you don't have to worry. When the time comes, they will go to mines, factories, or wherever they want to survive in other ways. As a smart person like you, don't you know that farmers want to survive through more than just farming? Archbishop Rocher is not completely ignorant of the sufferings of the people, but his exposure to them in Vienna over the years has convinced him that there are always more choices than difficulties. Under Franz's intervention, the economy of the Austrian Empire had made great progress compared with the same period in history, and Vienna, as the center of the empire, had made great progress. Everyone seemed to be treated with kindness, and hunger seemed to be far away, because even during the Great Famine in Vienna in 1838, there were no hordes of people dying of cold and starvation. Archbishop Rocher cared more about Central America than Ireland. Archduke Franz's policy of replacing birds with cages had almost hollowed out the local indigenous people, and in order to fill this vacancy, the church had to transfer people from other places. The situation in the Austrian Empire is very good, and few people are willing to leave. Even if they want to develop overseas, they will give priority to royal colonies such as West Africa. After all, Austrians in the Lusitania region are almost all shareholders of overseas development companies. Of course, it's more motivating to work for yourself. Archbishop, you don't seem to care about your fellow Catholics in Ireland at all. I told you before that the British do not allow Irish people to do business, and there are not enough local factories to absorb so many people. Franz was a little dissatisfied. The magician in front of him obviously wanted to help the Armenians as far away as the Ottomans. Why is there such indifference to the Irish? Archduke Franz, you mentioned what Louis Pasteur said when he refused your invitation. Science has no borders, but scientists have nationalities. In fact, our church is the same. If those Irish people are on Austrian soil and are subjects of the Austrian Empire like us, then the church has a duty to help them and will do its best to help them. But Ireland is in the UK and the Irish are British. I'm the religious leader of the Austrian Empire. I'm afraid it would not be appropriate to save the people of the enemy country with donations from the subjects of the empire, right? After hearing this, Franz was filled with dark clues. Before, he only thought that Archbishop Rocher was a magician, but now he realized that he was a smart aleck magician. Archbishop, in addition to worshipping God, the church's obligation is to spread the gospel to the world. This gospel can be from God. Of course it can also be from Austria, or from the Habsburg family. Of course Archbishop Prussia understood what Franz said, but he still couldn't understand what was the use of showing kindness to those Irish people. Can the Austrian Empire still carve a piece of land next to the British mainland? In fact, Franz's approach is similar to the approach of treating prisoners of war preferentially. After all, capital has no borders. If the capitalists lose, the worst they can do is run from the UK to the United States. But whether it was World War I or World War II, the people who really fought on the battlefield were civilians. They were either out of patriotism, or were forced to do nothing, or they wanted to maintain world peace, or they wanted to plough the fields for their own country, to acquire land, or to establish Greater East Asia and co-prosperity. In short, the rulers will get a high-sounding reason to make them feel that they are right. What Franz wants to do now is to fundamentally dismantle the British's combat effectiveness, and the Irish are the best breakthrough. Chapter 359 Overcoming Pain. October 15th, 1842. University of Vienna, Austria. Lawford Williamson Lange is a little-known American doctor, and today he was invited to one of the highest universities in the world, the Austrian Imperial University of Vienna, to announce his research results. In fact, Lawford had already performed such an operation as early as March 20th, 1842. He used ether gas to successfully anesthetize a young man named James Webb and remove the mass, but the achievements of Lawford Williamson Lange are not well known. In fact, in the following years, many doctors claimed that they invented ether anesthesia. In particular, Dr. William Thomas Green Morton's successful performance at the MIT General Hospital allowed many people to see the effect of ether anesthesia and regard him as the first person to conduct inhalation anesthesia experiments. Even Morton's epitaph reads, "Because of him, the pain of surgery can be prevented and eliminated." Before him, surgery was extremely painful. After him, science defeated pain. But, in fact, whether it was Morton or the previously mentioned Lange, these two people were obsessed with fighting for patent rights after they invented ether anesthesia, resulting in nothing being accomplished afterwards, which makes people sigh. However, Franz was not interested in caring about who invented inhalation anesthesia. If he had liked, he could have done it himself a few years ago, but it was better to let professionals do such risky things. Even today, when the technology is mature, anesthesia is still a technology that carries great risks. Franz is concerned about how many civilians and injured soldiers can be saved in the future by the concept of sterility and anesthesia technology. Lawford Williamson Lange's use of ether was completely accidental. When he was studying in school, he discovered that many participants at some parties inhaled laughing gas or ether for entertainment. They not only danced and looked funny, but also often fell down or feel no pain when touching something. So he just used ether gas with the attitude of giving it a try. There was no scientific proof before, and he didn't even know what the dosage should be. At this time, Lawford Williamson Lange accepted a $10,000 bonus from the University of Vienna. He had to bite the bullet and use his little tricks in front of countless experts and scholars for the sake of safety and success. Lawford Williamson Lange found a gout patient. Lawford promised the patient free gout relief and would pay him $500. But the gout patient never dreamed that he would never be able to open his eyes again. At first, Lawford Williamson Lange's American-style opening speech had the opposite effect. After all, the people who came to watch his demonstration took time out of their busy schedules to see scientific progress, not to listen to his vulgar talk. A joke. The old American opener is to start with a dirty joke and funny sarcasm. Lawford compared the gout patient's feet to a beautiful woman. According to him, as long as the tube is inserted into the patient's mouth, and after 30 seconds, you can do whatever you want. However, the Austrian doctors and scholars present generally had poor English proficiency, and they watched the demonstration in a very formal manner, so they did not find it funny. In fact, Franz also felt that Lawford's opening remarks were not very good. This metaphor was not funny at all. On the contrary, it was a bit disgusting. Thalia and Ajani, who were watching the demonstration together, both looked at Franz with strange eyes. The former felt that there was obviously a mysterious powder brought back by Costa, some kind of resentful explorer, from the Amazon rainforest, so what else could he do with either? What? The latter felt that Franz must have some ulterior hobbies, so he needed the other party to lose consciousness. In short, both felt that Franz had evil intentions. Scientific progress. What do you know? Think about it. When you extract teeth in the future, the doctor will use pliers to clamp your decayed tooth and spin it like a crocodile. Then you will know the greatness of this invention. As soon as Franz finished speaking, Failure and Ajani deliberately showed their white teeth point. According to Franz's opinion, people who often eat sweets should have poor teeth point. In fact, this idea is wrong. People who often eat sweets do not necessarily have poor teeth, but people who often eat low quality food must have poor teeth point. During this period, it was not uncommon for poor people in their 30s to lose all their teeth, because the food they ate was too coarse and caused serious wear and tear on their teeth, and things such as toothpaste and tooth powder were not yet widely available. Point at the beginning of the demonstration, Lawford Williamson Lange had the subject inhale a large amount of ether gas for 30 seconds to ensure that he would not wake up during the operation. Point after confirming that the other party was unconscious, Dr. Lawford began his performance. He deliberately made the incision very large so that the doctors present could feel the pain of cutting through the flesh. Point however, Dr. Lawford was not in a hurry to remove the toothy. Instead, he deliberately used a knife to cut and rummage around the patient's foot and then sutured it. Point. Although Austrian doctors and scholars had previously been disdainful of the American, they now realized the magic of this new technology and began to watch the operation carefully. Point. In the end, a total of 12 large and small toothy were removed. The operation was very successful. Just as there was thunderous applause, someone discovered something was wrong. Point. The subject's body has undergone some special changes that only occur in dead people. A Hungarian medical student at the University of Vienna, Semil Wiesigners Philip, discovered the anomaly and immediately asked Lawford Williamson Lange about it. Point. The latter was still immersed in his own success and did not notice the changes in the subject. When Dr. Lawford examined him, he fell to the ground. He's dead. Suddenly, the whole place was in an uproar. It was not uncommon for people to die from excessive inhalation of ether gas, but it happened in full view of the public, which still sounded the alarm to the Austrian medical community. Point. Is ether a magical gas that saves lives, or a poisonous gas that kills people? Invisible. The medical community in Vienna launched a comprehensive debate on this, and the result of the debate was naturally the code for the safe use of ether, an anesthetic gas. The code stipulated that ether is a dangerous drug and must be prescribed and used by professional doctors at the same time. A series of more in-depth studies on the hazards and dosage of ether were also carried out, which made a huge contribution to the anesthesia industry in the Austrian Empire in the future. Point. As for Dr. Lawford Williamson Lange, although his negligence caused the death of one person, because the legal provisions at that time were not perfect and there were no relevant punishment provisions, and the person who died was not an Austrian, he still returned to the United States with his winnings. Franz deeply regretted the death of the gout patient, but he was also glad that he was not enthusiastic enough to choose to do the experiment himself. Otherwise he would not be able to escape the reputation of a murderer in the future. Point. Telia felt that this thing was too dangerous and should consider oral drug anesthesia, such as laudanum and the like. Ajani thought that other gas could be used as an interrogation tool in the future. Chapter 360. A friend comes from afar. October 20th, 1842, Venice. Point. A low-caste businessman from India visited here. He brought a large amount of spices and jewelry to sell at the port, which soon attracted the covetousness of gangsters and local gentry. Point. Then the hapless businessman was framed by a combination of local gangs and tycoons, and imprisoned for disrupting the market and disrespecting local traditions. Although the businessman brought hundreds of followers, it was still useless to Venice where the navy and army were stationed. Point. Everything would have been settled, but Baron Brooke just came back from California, and after casually looking through the files, he discovered something fishy. Point. Of course, his experience in the United States in the past few years has also taught this upright official a lot. This time he did not angrily go to the local court to argue, but went to the Navy Commander-in-Chief Archduke Friedrich and the Governor of Venetia, Prince Eltas. Archduke Friedrich and the Governor of Venice Prince Elters were also willing to give the central bank governor a face, and 2 super heavyweights intervened in the same case. This case will naturally be brought out for e-trial. Even Franz, who is far away in Vienna, has heard about it. He is very dissatisfied with the local officials. After all, Austria intends to open its doors for business, not to engage in this kind of killing of chickens. To lay eggs activity. Franz was very interested in a person who came to Austria from India to do business. After all, in business, many friends lead to many paths, especially in a product-rich region like India, where Austria can always find what he wants. However, as the case progressed, something else soon became involved. The Indian businessman's name was Viroy Sadani, and he was a Shudra. This is very rare, because Shudras are a lower caste in India. At this time, whether it was his sea-going ship, the cargo of spices and jewelry, or the 500 capable sailors under his command, none of them looked like the property of a low-caste businessman. But in fact, the Adani family made its fortune during the Age of Discovery, and was once an agent of the Dutch in India. Viroy Sadani was the kind of rich man who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But what Franz saw was a strong Indian man who was not inferior to the gods. Although his speech frequently aroused laughter in the court, it was not because his language was not standard enough, but because he naturally made a lot of jokes when he spoke Dutch as German. Viroy Sadani's firm eyes and calm tone, coupled with her powerful figure, are just like Drogo Kalana's Song of Ice and Fire. When local tycoons accused Viroy Sadani of being an Indian Ocean pirate, he produced letters of recommendation from Tanzania's governor Beni Irvin and King Said of Oman. This made Franz very interested. After all, these 2 letters of recommendation were much more difficult to deal with than the big ship and hundreds of Indian sailors. In fact, this Viroy Sadani was one of the wealthy Indian businessmen who originally funded Beni Irvin. This person also had many years of trade relations with the Kingdom of Oman, so he was able to get the recommendation letter. The purpose of Viroy's visit was actually to seek advice from Franz, who once entertained heroes from various Indian states in Calcutta during the Indian Ocean Straits. These heroes valued Franz higher than any white man who had been to India, because Franz knew what they wanted, pointed out several roads, and was willing to help. One of the ways is to study in Austria. As for whether they want to study organizational structure or science and technology, Franz will not interfere too much. He will only help those people enter Austrian universities to study. However, Viroy's trip was not to seek education, but to seek advice on how the subjects of Kerala can be equal. After the trial, Viroy met Franz as she wished. Dear Archduke Franz, you are younger than I thought, although my friend Beni Irvin has reminded me more than once, you're paler than I thought, too. Franz quipped. Viroy Sadani did something that he had not done even when facing the Maharaja of Trivandrum. He knelt down and prostrated himself before Franz with clasped hands and knees. Franz was somewhat accustomed to it, because there were many people outside Europe who worshipped him as a god. Even in Vienna, there were people like the old stick who worshipped him as a god. Mr. Viroy, your courage is admirable. But regarding your question, it is impossible to achieve absolute equality. However, a country with relative equality and mutual respect between people is still possible. What do I do? Viroy asked. It's not what you should do, but what your country should do. The people should be prosperous, the country should be strong, and the country should be clean. This is the solution. Franz replied. The people are prosperous and the country is strong. The king is pure. Yes, an ancient Oriental philosopher once said that etiquette is known in practice. If a person cannot even meet the most basic needs of food and clothing, then what he wants to know must be how to make money and how to have enough to eat. Instead of following the so-called social rules, weak countries have no diplomacy and no dignity. Everything you own in a weak country can be taken away by a strong country, including your life. Rulers need to know their position, and who are their friends, and who are their enemies. In fact, this statement was only told by Franz to Viroy, because he could see that the other party actually wanted to be the king. If Viroy just wanted relative equality, Franz would have told him the shortcut to rule by law. But an ambitious person would obviously prefer Franz's current statement. After all, India or Kerala at this time is in a situation of internal and external troubles. Internally stupid princes and nobles are rampant in the countryside, and the common people are colluding with the British. The outside British stepped up their plunder and controlled customs. If you want to make money, you must feed British officials, otherwise you will not be able to sell your goods, no matter how good they are. Especially for ocean-going merchants like Vera Wise. Once the ship and cargo are impounded, bankruptcy is almost an inevitable outcome. Fortunately, the Adani family's centuries of management allowed him to connect with the Omanis and the Dutch. Otherwise, no matter how capable and courageous Vera Wise was, he would inevitably end up with a tragic ending of ruined family and death. So Vera Wise came not only for herself this time, but also for the future of the Adani family. Archduke Franz, what should I do? This time Vera Wise asked more directly, and Franz naturally did not shy away. You have many followers, and you are also very smart, and know how to hedge your bets. You can choose to sell half of the cargo on the ship for weapons, and exchange the other half for Austrian Empire goods and sell them to the Indian princes and nobles, or to local people. Pay a bribe to do what you want. Vera Wise felt a little incredible that the other party could see through her mind so easily. In fact, this is not difficult to analyze, because he had previously placed bets on both Beni Erbil and King Said of Oman. This time should be no exception. Although for the Austrian Empire, trade with Vera Wise was dispensable, Franz was still happy to see the destruction of the British backyard by this careerist. Chapter 361 Americans' Westward Expansion. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz looked at the map and saw an island in the Pacific that had only been marked in recent years. Hawaii. When you think of Hawaii, you probably think of beaches, sunshine, beautiful women, hula dances, opening durians with bare hands, and endless happy people. But in fact, there was a history of blood and tears here. Before the Europeans arrived in Hawaii, there were nearly 300,000 indigenous residents living here. Another way of saying it is 800,000. However, in less than 2 decades after that, the population declined. It dropped to less than 60,000. In 1842, US President John Tyler first recognized the Kingdom of Hawaii. As Franz expected, he was a very ambitious and capable president. According to the Americans themselves, they were afraid that Japan would send troops to occupy Hawaii, because according to the US whaling fleet report at the time, the Japanese had ambitions for Hawaii. If Japan forcibly annexes Hawaii, the United States will intervene on the grounds of anti-aggression. In fact, the credibility of this is not high, because the Kingdom of Hawaii was supported by the British. Putting aside the distance between Japan and Hawaii, the word British alone could make the Tokugawa shogunate flinch. Hawaii is a natural transit point in the Pacific Ocean, which was the dream of any great power in the era of sea power. This was the reason why the United States truly recognized its government. At that time, the United States, like other Western powers, hoped to control Hawaii through colonization. It is a pity that the diplomat active on the British political stage at that time was Palmerston, who did not take the face of Americans into consideration. After learning of the Americans' ambitions, they directly publicly declared that Britain had sovereignty over Hawaii. Historically, it is 1843, but it is advanced in the book. What the British did was a huge blow to the US federal government, but the latter had nothing to do with the former. In fact, in addition to British and American colonists, there are also Chinese, Japanese, and French people on the island. The Chinese and Japanese mainly came here to trade sandalwood and work, and of course the French also came here to colonize. However, the French obviously arrived later, and were equally helpless against the British. Although France occupied Texas at this time, John Tyler was no mediocre man. He believed that, although France and the United States were rivals on the North American continent, they could fully cooperate on the Hawaiian issue and jointly fight against the British. Although Britain was extremely powerful at this time, the front line in the world was too long and there were too many enemies. Therefore, when encountering strong enemies, they could only choose to avoid or wait and see. However, after French King Louis Philippe and Minister Guizot learned that the US government proposed to join forces, they rejected it. This is not only because of the strategic conflict between France and the United States, but also because of the unique sense of superiority of Europeans in this era. They regard all civilizations outside Europe as barbaric civilizations, especially France in this regard. Point of course, Louis Philippe was still very shy about offending people, so Gizzard had no choice but to continue to act as a villain. In his letter, he accused the US government of being a villain. John Taylor just laughed after reading it. Just throw it away as garbage. Point at this time, the United States still had a bigger problem, and that was some disobedient Indians and restless neighbors. Listing Indians has always been a plus in American history. Almost every great American president has done something for Indians. John Taylor was no exception. The Indian removal war had always been on his mind. John Taylor was a very self-denying man, and exterminating Indians was one of the few things that excited him. But at this time, after the operations of Andrew Jackson and others, the population of American Indians had greatly reduced, and most of them had moved to the West. John Taylor drew circles on the map and only had a few 100,000 Indians left to fiddle with, so he came up with the idea of moving them all to reservations in Oklahoma. This event will surely go down in history forever, John Taylor wrote in his diary. As Marlon Brando wrote in his acceptance speech at the Oscars, for 200 years we have been saying to the Indians who fought for their land, their lives, their families, their rights to freedom, lay down your arms, my friends, and we will survive together. They laid down their weapons and we massacred them. We lied to them. We defrauded them of their land. We starved them into making agreements that defrauded them, which we called treaties, but never kept. Of course, this time was no exception. At first, the Indians resisted heroically, causing the US Army to suffer heavy losses. The battle loss ratio between the two sides was about 1:15. After losing more than 200 soldiers, the Americans repeated their old tricks. First, sign an agreement with some tribes and ask them to help you eliminate the uncooperative tribes, and promise to give them cattle, sheep, pasture, and without leaving their homes. This strategy worked quickly. Those tribes that resisted were defeated, and hundreds of thousands of Indians set foot on the road to the reservation. Afterwards, the US Army did not forget the friends who helped them. Looting was accompanied by massacres, and the last batch of Indians had to embark on this trail of blood and tears. And the last hundreds of thousands of Indians, less than 60,000, successfully entered the reservation, and those bones scattered on the Great Plains will eventually be buried by wind and sand. Unfortunately, whether it was the Polynesians in Hawaii or the Indians on the North American continent, Franz was unable to do anything. Moreover, due to the westward expansion of the United States, a large number of Indian tribes poured into California. These Indians were submissive when facing the Americans, but seemed to be arrogant when facing the Hispanic whites in California. It's a pity that Friedrich's second brother, Archduke Karl Ferdinand, the second son of Archduke Karl, is stationed here. He was a man who did his duty without mercy, whether facing the natives of California, the Mexicans, or the invading American and Indian tribes. There is a huge generational difference in weapons between the Indian tribes and the Austrian army stationed in California, and the quality of the soldiers is also different. On one side there are elite regular troops, and on the other side there are some primitive herdsmen who are hungry and skinny. There was never any suspense in the battle between the two sides. Most of the time it was a one-sided massacre, but even so, the Indian tribes did not give up their attack on California. In fact, the reason why these Indians were brave was because the Americans promised behind them they will become the masters of the land they conquered. 4. A false promise. A group of hopeless people carried out an impossible invasion. But as the war continued, the casualties on the Austrian Empire's side continued to increase. As a result, John von Cinna, the newly arrived acting high-ranking official in California, decided to fight fire with fire. Chapter 362. Mr. Lincoln. Exchange the invaders' heads for your freedom and land. John von Cinna's approach was equivalent to placing a bounty on the heads of the invading Americans with land and freedom. This trick really worked. Although the Indians were not good at fighting head-on, they were surprisingly good at being bandits and bounty hunters. Soon the English-speaking white people in California suffered. The Indians could not tell the difference between Americans and Austrians, or Spanish, but they knew the difference between English and German. The infiltration of American civilians was severely dealt a blow, and even those culprits who had previously tried to incite the Indians to attack California were retaliated by the Indians. When the Indians found John von Cinna with the bodies and weapons of the invaders, he happily fulfilled his promise and not only gave them land, but also rewarded them with some grain and the so-called proof of friendly people point. The so-called certificate of friendly persons is a black gold card with the Austrian flag printed on it, which contains the identity information of some people. This information can be checked in the city's archives. In fact, this move was not only to fight fire with fire, but also to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, it eliminated the American invaders, and on the other hand, it also increased the population of California. After all, this area is too large, and the labor force is too small. Austrian law prohibits the sale of slaves. It is still somewhat reluctant to rely solely on the labor contributed by Mexico and the former Central American federal regions. It seems like a good idea to absorb these homeless Indians. After all, there are always people to do gold mining, construction workers, city cleaning, and farm work. Later, the Indians were not killed by the Americans, but they also wanted to become Californians. John von Cinna made new conditions, that is, if you bring one laborer, you will be given 20 pesos, and if you bring 5 laborers, you will be a Californian legal residents. Although this was very unkind, it did quickly increase the population of California. John von Cinna was the illegitimate son of Mr. Cinna, chairman of the Austrian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In fact, Franz hoped that the old Cinna could take over Baron Bruck's job. After all, he is more experienced, more capable, and more loyal and reliable. At this time, the income from the gold mines in California was extremely exaggerated. Although Archduke Karl Ferdinand was in charge, he was a soldier after all, and it was impossible for him to know everything about business and urban planning. As a Jewish illegitimate son, John von Cinna was very eager to express himself, at least to remove one of the labels on himself, so he had to work harder than anyone else. But his approach was also more extreme. John von Cinna was not as rigid as Baron Bruck. He understood human nature well. After some investigation, he set a goal of 5 times the previous amount. This made the gold mining companies and teams attracted by the gold mine indignant, saying that such a goal was simply impossible to achieve, and they expressed that they would go on strike collectively. John von Cinna immediately signed and approved it, and then promised the remaining people that, as long as the predetermined goals are completed, the remaining gold will be yours. As a result, the mining efficiency in California has really increased by 500%, and the urban development speed has become faster, because money always has to be consumed. The number of people in the related service industry is also increasing, because the high wages in this area naturally attract strength is also strong. But the negative consequence of this destructive mining is to accelerate the depletion of gold mines. Of course, since this place is not the territory of the Austrian Empire, John von Cinna does not care about this kind of thing at all. What he wants is more, faster, better, province, and use the most perfect gesture to complete the task assigned to him by Archduke Franz in 1842. John Tyler, who was in power, was struggling to cope with this rapidly developing world. Although every American believed that the United States was destiny, the facts before them forced them to admit that things seemed not that simple. With Britain to the north, Mexico to the south, and California occupied by the Austrians to the west, with the French sandwiched in between, the Americans' westward march seemed extremely difficult. And Lincoln, one of the greatest presidents in American history, seemed to be in trouble of his own making. Although Lincoln is like a god in history books, in fact this great man was not a tolerant and above-board person in life. Lincoln liked to satirize others and humiliate them by throwing satirical articles on the floor for others to pick up and read. Of course, he was also very smart. For example, when he was opposite a politician named James Shields, he chose to write an anonymous letter. After all, the other party is a conceited, fierce and aggressive soldier. Lincoln published an article in the Springfield Daily News to satirize James Shields. The humiliating words naturally attracted attention. This aroused the latter's anger, but the former felt that he had written an anonymous letter, so he should be spared. But in fact, privacy has never existed in the United States. James Shields used his connections to easily find Lincoln, who could only confess James Shields wanted to protect his honor by demanding a duel with Lincoln. A soldier wanted to duel with a lawyer. Although Lincoln was tall and rugged, his brain was not stupid. He immediately objected. Enraged, James Shields allowed Lincoln to choose his weapon first and even shoot first, and then found other Whigs to force Lincoln to accept a duel. In the end, Lincoln could only accept the duel. James Shields was a famous sharpshooter, but Lincoln had no systematic firearms training at all. Lincoln served in the army and received a commendation, but the reason was that his troops were well organized, so Mr. Lincoln chose to use a sword as a weapon because he felt that his heightened hands were more advantageous, but he soon sadly discovered that the opponent's swordsmanship was also very good. There are two records about this duel in history. One is that Lincoln's aides persuaded James Shields to give up the duel, and the other is that Lincoln chopped off a birch tree before the duel to scare the opponent into giving up the duel. In short, the result of this duel was that James Shields gave up the duel. However, as a history buff and a fighting fan, Franz wants to see what will happen if this duel continues, so he sent someone to protect James Shields in advance. When Lincoln's aides came to James Shields' house, they saw a large number of gangster gunmen inside and outside the house. The clever aide immediately gave up the use of force and used settlement money instead. Mr. James, God is merciful. He would not want any great American to fall in a pool of blood tomorrow. Do you understand what I mean? But where is my reputation? Damn it, what about Abraham Lincoln's slanderous words about me? James Shields was very angry. Although he was a very impulsive person, he did not dare to say the word duel easily. After all, this was a matter of life and death. Mr. Lincoln and you both have very bright political futures. You don't want to just be a state legislator for the rest of your life, right? I have $10,000 here, which I believe is enough to save you from the loss of face. Chapter 363 Duel. As a result, John von Cinna, the newly arrived acting high-ranking official in California, decided to fight fire with fire. Mr. Lincoln and you both have very bright political futures. You don't want to just be a state legislator for the rest of your life, right? I have $10,000 here, which I believe is enough to save you from the loss of face. $10,000 was a huge amount of money in 1842, and the annual salary of an American cowboy was only $30 or $40. Fighting to death for tens of dollars or a few cents of beer is common in pubs. A family farmer's income is usually only a few $100s, and even the distinguished governor only earns $1,000. $10,000 was undoubtedly a huge amount of money for James Shields. To be honest, he was tempted, but three of the biggest local gangsters pressed him for $100,000. Of course this was Franz's fault. After all, it was impossible for him to send Austrians to protect Lincoln, so he set up a bet. One is naturally a public gambling game, while the other is a private gambling game. The rules are simple, winner takes all, but a sufficient entrance fee is required. Franz bought Lincoln to win for $100,000. This amount of money was enough to drive people crazy at the time, but not many people could afford to bet $100,000 at the time. So the people sent by Franz came up with a good idea for several local gang families to join forces. Yes, in the end, the three largest local gangsters pulled together $100,000, and the witnesses were the local militia commander and the governor. Of course, the gangsters thought it was their own face, but they didn't know that it was the face given by US President John Taylor himself. John Taylor didn't dare not give Franz face, and he didn't know if he really had a mental illness, but he behaved strangely more than once or twice. He heard that he even sailed to the North Pole, searching for penguins, and finally returned to the Austrian Empire with a boatload of seals. God knows whether such a partner will one day tell him about how he helped himself and old Harris rise to power. Of course, John Taylor also confirmed the corruption and incompetence of the European royal family. It is simply nonsense to let these freaks and madmen decide national affairs. Back to business. Sorry, I have my honor, James. Shields finally resisted the temptation and refused $10,000. After all, there were at least 20 gunmen inside and outside his home. If he refuses to duel with Lincoln at this time and makes the heads of these big families lose money, you can imagine his fate. Lincoln's aides never expected that this would happen. They thought that bringing a few more people would be able to scare the other party. But if that didn't work, there would be a settlement of $10,000. Most people simply couldn't resist such a temptation point, but they never expected that they were already on the big shot's chessboard and all actions were out of their control. Please think again. You still have a bright future. Mr. Lincoln is the person favored by the party leader. An aide grabbed the arm of James Shields excitedly, and he wanted to make a last-ditch effort to use the party leader to suppress the opponent point. But before James Shields could react, the gang bodyguards around him couldn't stand it anymore. Pay attention to your hands. If you don't want it, I can cut it off for you, a strong man said in a bad tone. Lincoln's aides immediately became angry. When had they ever been so disrespected? Watch your foul mouth. Be careful. But before he could finish his words, he was picked up like a chicken by a sturdy bodyguard. Come here. Let's talk. The assistant in charge of paperwork still wanted to struggle, but soon 3 or 4 more strong men surrounded him, and cordial exchanges could be heard when the few people arrived in the yard. The remaining 2 assistants could only look at each other in confusion. In fact, James Shields was also very embarrassed. Although this was his home, the situation was beyond his control. The 3 of them could only drink tea in silence. By the time the exchange ended, the assistant in charge of paperwork had broken glasses. His clothes and face were covered with mud, and one arm seemed to be broken. The companions didn't say much when they saw this scene. They just said goodbye to the master and left in a hurry. When Lincoln saw the miserable situation of his aides and heard about the cause and effect, he could only sigh and decided to fight. Because Franz invited many reporters, the bridge where the duel was held was already full of people before the duel even started. Some of them were reporters, some were civilians watching the excitement, and most were gamblers who placed bets. Relatives and friends of both parties also rushed to the scene. Some people began to cry bitterly out of fear of losing their loved ones or fear of seeing death, but they were soon insulted by the onlookers who came to see the blood. James Shields was a soldier. He was 1.81 meters tall. The sword he carried was a weapon that had accompanied him in battles for many years. He had killed 2 Indians and an outlaw. James Shields paced back and forth on the bridge because Lincoln had not yet arrived. Although he had participated in 2 duels, it did not mean that he would not be nervous, and the gamble behind it kept him awake all night. However, James Shields was a little lucky at this time, because if Lincoln voluntarily gave up the duel, he could win without a fight and would not have to worry about his political future. After killing Lincoln. Finally, 3 minutes before the duel, Lincoln arrived in a carriage. He took off his shirt to reveal the white undershirt underneath. Lincoln, who was 1.93 meters tall, was undoubtedly much stronger than James Shields imagined. But fortunately, the 2 sides chose to compete with swords. If it were wrestling, boxing, etc., James Shields really didn't have much chance of winning. The notary of the duel was a church priest. After checking the weapons of both sides, he read a bunch of duel rules, and the duel officially began. To be honest, the duel between the 2 sides was very ugly. Although James Shields was known as a master of swordsmanship, he only took a few fencing lessons when he was in school and slashed 2 immobile men when he was a frontier soldier. Although Lincoln had never learned swordsmanship, he was tall, long-armed and very strong. He could chop him violently when he got up, which gave him an advantage. The battle between the 2 sides was just like the fight scenes in later Hollywood blockbusters. There was no skill or tactics at all. It was basically just hacking and chopping to compare strength. In the end, it was James Shields who was more experienced and used a sneak attack, seizing the opportunity to knee Lincoln's lower body. The latter fell down in pain immediately, and the former seized the opportunity to attack fiercely, and finally knocked away the sword from the opponent's hand. You lose, you damn fool. If you could have kept your mouth shut, you wouldn't have ended up like this. Just as James Shields was declaring victory, Lincoln suddenly got up and pushed the former in the chest. James Shields only scratched the opponent's face and arms by swinging the knife in his hand, but he was accidentally pushed off the bridge. After that, both sides began to rush to save their own people. Although Lincoln suffered 3 minor injuries, his life was not serious, but James Shields, who who had the advantage, drowned. This kind of duel even dumbfounded the notary, but in the end, Lincoln, the man who survived to the end, won and preserved his honor. Originally, the gangsters planned to pay off their gambling debts, but the next day US federal troopers and militiamen arrived at their homes. As a result, Franz made $100,000. In tears. From then on, the gangsters in Illinois remembered Lincoln and vowed to make him pay for his blood debt. It seems that there is God's will in the dark. Chapter 364 Christmas. Austria, Venice. The deal with Verweiser Danny was a success and Franz managed to clear a cache of old equipment for the Austrian Imperial Army. Although Verweiser was a careerist, the princes and nobles of Trivandrum were indeed not considered human beings. They even instituted a clothing tax to make up for the shortfall. That's right. Local law stipulates that all untouchables, regardless of gender, must pay a clothing tax, otherwise they need to go topless. This sounds like a ridiculous law, but it was enforced until World War II. Others are even more outrageous, such as the nose-piercing tax. The name is rather weird, so I need to explain it. Indians worship cows and will pierce the noses of their wives to show that they are their women. However, the local king of Trivandrum felt that this violated the rights of the nobility, so he made all non-noble women pay a nose-piercing tax, otherwise their nose rings would be removed and their noses would be cut off. So Franz had no regrets that his actions might kill such a person. And he was even prepared to eat an extra bowl of rice at dinner to celebrate. In fact, it is not that there is no rice in Europe, but the chefs here treat it as a dish. That's right. This is a dish. Chefs usually pour a lot of olive oil and butter into the pot, then add onions, potatoes, and truffles, saute them until fragrant, and then add the rice to the pot. At the same time, add butter and continue to stir fry until golden brown, then add chicken stock or other quality stock to simmer, then add Italian celery, thyme, rosemary, cinnamon, longan, clove buds and other spices after it's out of the pan. Top it with cream, cheese, or tomato sauce, and it's done. In response to Archduke Franz's hobby, bizarre behavior of eating rice, chefs develop various dishes based on rice. Of course, in Franz's eyes, these things are just rice bowls, but they taste a little weird. 1842, Christmas. The fiscal revenue announced by the Austrian Empire was 350 million florins, which was more than double the same period in history. At the same time, railroads, colonies, and all walks of life were developing for the better. In the 8 years after joining the German Zollverein, the national income of the Austrian Empire increased by 100%, and even soldiers could receive an annual military pay of 200 florins during the same period. Prices only increased by 25%. And the prices of some commodities even dropped. However, there were more and more types of commodities, and people had more needs. After having enough food and clothing, sewing machines have become the goal pursued by many people, and this is not an unreachable goal. Although 400 florins is still a lot of money in the eyes of ordinary people, with new financial methods such as installment payment, the pressure is far less than before. In fact, not only Austria, but also the economies of German states are developing rapidly. For example, Luxembourg's economy has increased by 400% in 8 years. This is of course due to their nationwide steel making and rich local resources. However, compared with the rapidly growing economy, the political situation faced by Luxembourg was not optimistic. Half of their land was occupied by Belgium. In 1839, the two sides even fought over it. After causing 139 casualties, France and Prussia announced their intervention. This war historically, the British-dominated London Conference directly assigned the Western Territory of Luxembourg to Belgium. However, this London Conference was not successfully convened at all, and the agreement it formulated was naturally not recognized by the great powers. The people of Luxembourg were actually very indifferent to Prussia's military occupation, but compared to the extravagant king who treated them as human beings and their covetous neighbors, being a German seemed pretty good. Military occupation refers to the decision by Prussia to protect Luxembourg after the Congress of Vienna. The extravagant king who treated them as human beings refers to the then King of the Netherlands, William Frederick. At that time, he was also the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, but he did not care at all about the life and death of the Luxembourg people. He was indifferent to Belgium's invasion of Luxembourg. He also cut off forests from Luxembourg, causing Luxembourg to lose 75% of its territory at one time. The eyeing neighbor refers to Leopold I. He was the founding king of Belgium and a heroic leader. With the support of Britain and France, he dismembered the Netherlands. Later, he also made many achievements in domestic affairs and economic development, which also made Belgium a minority. The country that escaped the storm of 1848. Under British leadership, the Netherlands admitted defeat in the war and Belgium became independent. But the Luxembourg parliament refused to sign the peace agreement. After all, it represents half of the country and 40% of the population. Because Luxembourg was protected by Prussia, the Dutch army could not enter Luxembourg to suppress it. This matter was delayed from 1839 to Christmas 1842. Over the years, Luxembourgers have worked hard to save money. Just a week before Christmas, the 83-year-old member of parliament Kolder spoke on behalf of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg at the regular meeting of the German Confederation. I want to accuse Austria and Prussia. They can fight the slave trade all over the world and even go to Africa and Asia to liberate those barbaric peoples, but they turn a blind eye to the tragedy of their compatriots at their doorstep. Just in 1839, two robbers broke into our house. One commits murder and arson, the other enslaves us. Two robbers fought on our land, but it was us who suffered in the end. They divided our territory and robbed our families, but our brothers, our fathers, Prussia and Austria did nothing. Why? Because we are too weak and insignificant. But the biggest kidnapping case of this century is happening before your eyes. 380,000 Luxembourgers were kidnapped by Belgium, and 150,000 by the Netherlands. You all propagate that you will ban the slave trade and combat slave trading, but at this time, 420,000 Germans are enslaved by the King of the Netherlands without paying a penny. Are you blind? I accuse this incompetent father and brother, this useless confederacy, this unfair world. Representative Kurdry's accusation made the representatives of the German Confederation feel uncomfortable, especially the representatives of Austria and Prussia. They also felt that they were very wronged. They came to attend a regular meeting. Who knew they would encounter this kind of meeting? In fact, the situation in Luxembourg is very clear to all countries, but theoretically the Netherlands is its suzerain country, and the King of the Netherlands is also the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. Even if other countries wanted to help, they had to seek the consent of the Netherlands first. The partition of Luxembourg was obviously approved by the Netherlands. There is no legal problem with this. In addition, the whole thing was led by Britain and France, so no one dared to point fingers. The entire venue fell into silence because the Luxembourg representative's statement was unreasonable, but a kind of national feeling was brewing, and fellow Germans could not ignore their experiences. However, the final voting power was still in the hands of the two great powers Austria and Prussia, and other states were unable to do so, even if they wanted to. After all, Belgium and the Netherlands are backed by Britain and France. If they want to fight against the great powers, they need Austria and Prussia, who are also great powers, to come forward. But no matter what, the whole of Germany and even Europe will have a restless Christmas. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 365, The Last Gift. Frankfurt, Provisional Parliament Hall of the German Confederation. Facing the silent audience, the old Kurder once again issued a torture that went straight to the heart. You were all blind before, and now you're all deaf. Still, no one answered, because this was too heavy for the representatives present. Maybe because one of his words will ruin his political future, or he will become the punching bag of the entire Confederate civilian population. Of course, it is also possible that it will be both. Ludwig von Lenz is a junior student at the University of Vienna. He is 1.82 meters tall, has a strong body, white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and has a standard German appearance, but he is a genuine Czech and born in Pressburg, Hungary. Logically speaking, a student is not qualified to be the entourage of the Austrian representative, but he is a die-hard royalist, which can be regarded as an outlier in the university. Yes, Austrian universities are the largest gathering place for anti-Austrian people, and many college students choose to declare themselves liberals. In order to be unconventional, the Austrian imperial government would naturally favor such loyal high-quality talents, so Ludwig von Renz could be charted as the entourage of the Austrian representative to the German Confederation. Old Kurda's words made this young man excited. In fact, he had always wanted to be a soldier. Because the salary was too low, he chose to apply for the University of Vienna to study law and become an official. It was also for the sake of his family and sister. What is the purpose of the German Confederation? Have you all forgotten it? Old Calder asked himself. You forgot. But I didn't forget. The members of the German Confederation defended each other and jointly defended the fortresses of Mainz, Luxembourg, Rastatt, Ulm and Landau as they entered Germany. Now our German fortress has been breached. What should we do? Old Kurt Thunder shouted at the top of his lungs, but still no one answered. The representative of Austria is Count Pillersdorf, a seasoned politician who has never had a significant presence, but is one of the core figures in Austrian imperial politics. Pillersdorf paid no attention to Luxembourg's request. In his eyes, Luxembourg was too far away from the Austrian Empire, and the cost of offending Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands was too high. It was a completely loss-making deal. If Austria really sends troops to help Luxembourg, the biggest beneficiary will be Prussia. After all, this empire is not interested in enclaves on the European continent. After losing the Austrian Netherlands as a high-ranking official in the empire, he naturally knows better than anyone else that under the seemingly peaceful situation in Europe, there are actually turbulent undercurrents, and it may not take a big spark to ignite the entire continent. The expansion of the empire in Italy has caused dissatisfaction among Britain and France. If it were not for the outstanding performance of the Austrian navy in the Turkish-Egyptian war, I'm afraid that the British would have threatened to block the Adriatic Sea. In fact, after the Turkish-Egyptian war, the Mediterranean fleet formed by the British on Crete was to suppress Austria and France. In short, Luxembourg is indeed poor, but that doesn't matter. Fight back. Defend our country. A lone voice appeared behind Pillersdorf. This was far beyond his own expectations, and of course it was beyond the expectations of the entire venue. The person who shouted this was naturally Ludwig von Lenz, a young man with a stupid head. Young people are already easily incited, let alone in the era of this nation in the 19th century. The voice from the Austrian side was not loud, but it was like thunder in the ears of the surrounding audience, because it represented an attitude. As a result, representatives of states with better relations with Austria immediately responded, because the Austrian Empire joined the German customs union, and at the same time occupied an absolutely dominant position. The Austrian Empire in this generation not only had a high reputation among the royal families of various countries, but also had a strong influence among the people. Naturally, there were more small states dependent on Austria. The Austrian Empire was the first to express its stance. This was a good opportunity to express itself. War. As for the princes of Saxony, Hanover, and Bavaria, they were eager for Austria or Prussia to step down, so they naturally joined the booing team. Prussian Foreign Minister Heinrich von Bülow was very angry with the Austrian Empire's approach, because Luxembourg was a protectorate of Prussia. How could Austria be allowed to take the lead, or does Austria want to return to its own Austrian Netherlands? This will undoubtedly increase Austria's strength and influence, which will be a great disadvantage to Prussia. Therefore, Prussia had to express its stance. Heinrich von Bülow stood up, and the audience immediately became quiet, because whether it was a war or a peace with the Netherlands depended on Prussia's attitude. The representatives of the German Confederation were inexplicably excited at this time. The consciousness of a nation was awakening. The 1,000 years of mutual attacks on this land seemed to be coming to an end at this moment. Gentlemen, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg is our German Confederation's barrier in the West, and has always defended us against threats from France and the Netherlands. Now that it is threatened, we in Prussia, as its protector, are naturally duty-bound. I will report it to His Majesty King Frederick William IV of our country, and ask him to make a decision. I also hope that all countries can provide full assistance. Heinrich von Bülow looked at the Austrian representative Count Pillersdorf. The former felt that he had an advantage. After all, Prussia would lead the war as a typical Junker nobleman. Heinrich von Bülow's views were completely opposite to those of a seasoned politician. Count Pillersdorfer didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this time. Originally, a reckless young man pushed Austria to the forefront, but now Heinrich von Bülow actually used Prussia to block the front. This should be a good thing, but then Austria will have to step into this muddy water, which may drag the entire Europe into the flames of war. He can already imagine the Prime Minister being furious. Earl Pillersdorf did not express his position, but stood up and prepared to leave. At this time, the old Kurder on the stage spoke. He was actually a very good politician, but he was destined to be difficult to achieve much in a small country like Luxembourg. He knew the concerns of the Austrian Empire. Thank you, compatriots, but we are not asking for anyone's mercy, but we intend to hire your army to get back what belongs to us. At Old Calder's signal, other representatives from Luxembourg carried heavy boxes to the middle of the venue. We, in Luxembourg, have accumulated a lot of money thanks to the care of our compatriots over the years, and I want to use it to hire you. At this time, boxes were opened one after another, revealing gold bars neatly arranged inside. This is the blood and sweat of 420,000 Luxembourg compatriots, the hope of 950,000 Luxembourgers, a total of 120 million florins. Frohe Nachten. N means Merry Christmas, English Merry Christmas. This was the last time Old Kurd re-slapped the German Confederacy in the face, and it was also the retreat he found for his compatriots. Chapter 366 Body Search. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was still admiring the Christmas clothes he designed. This year, there was a rare addition of a group of young and beautiful ladies to the palace. On his side, he had another aide, Colonel Bordeaux, a typical Austrian aristocrat who was a bit nervous. On the first day he came, he searched Jenny's body. The result can be imagined. Miss Jenny was preparing to report to Archduke Franz as usual, to have a small talk. However, when she walked to the door, she was stopped by someone with some unfamiliar faces. Although the guards were tall and majestic, they were very familiar at first glance. I know he is a young nobleman from the countryside. Because they seemed to have never seen a woman like a Jenny. Her unconcealed coveting made her laugh. Who are you? Do you have a warrant from Madame Sophie or Colonel Bordeaux to meet Archduke Franz? One of the guards said, but his tongue was involuntarily tied. This is actually an instinct. After all, in ancient times, most beautiful women were the personal property of the chiefs. Ordinary people did not dare to have ideas, because most of those who had ideas were killed by the chiefs, or killed. Chief himself becomes the chief. Therefore, when a man sees a beautiful woman, his heart beats faster and his adrenaline secretion increases. This is not necessarily a manifestation of love, but may also be a sense of crisis engraved in his genes. So loyal and reliable. Jenny smiled deliberately frivolously, like, "You're Colonel Bordeaux. I'm the equerry assigned by Madame Sophie to Archduke Franz. The tasks assigned to me by the Archduke have been completed, and the Archduke asked me to report to him as soon as I return. Can I come in, sir?" Jenny directly threw the pod to Franz, saying that Franz wanted to see her. These low-level guards did not dare to ask about Archduke Franz's affairs, nor did they dare to stop the attendants who were at the same level as her immediate superior. Not to mention that the other party is such a beautiful woman. The two guards wisely moved out of the way and performed a very standard military salute. Jenny seemed to be amused, and the beauty's smile also made the two guards feel refreshed. But in fact, she just deliberately made this approachable gesture because she instinctively felt that there was trouble coming for her. But at this moment, someone shouted, "Stop!" A tall and thin man ran over quickly. "Damn it, you idiots. Why didn't you let her in and search her body?" The tall and thin man roared angrily, almost spitting on the guards' faces. The two guards looked very frightened, and Jenny knew that this must be the so-called Colonel Bordeaux. As Franz's attendant, he didn't know that the arrival of Colonel Bordeaux was probably deliberately arranged by Mrs. Sophie. After all, the previous Captain Perish was obsessed with him. It seems that Mrs. Sophie was afraid that she would have too much power around Franz, so she deliberately sent people to cause trouble on her own, so that she could not win over the major. Of course, she could not bully him too badly, otherwise there would be another incident. New people were sent. Jenny said, after making up her mind. Ah, you Colonel Bordeaux? I asked them to let me in. Jenny did not use Franz to pressure her this time, because she wanted to win over the two guards, at least to act like she was on the same side with them. Naturally, the two guards did not know the deeper meaning behind this, they just thought that the other party was kind-hearted. Both of them secretly made up their minds and decided to commit themselves to each other, but no, their bodies would be shattered to pieces. Who are you? What right do you have to let my men go? This is Archduke Franz's room. Why are you going in? Do you have a conspiracy? Do you have any weapons on you? Bordeaux burst out with questions. Fortunately, Jenny had seen the other party's behavior pattern before and took out a fan in advance to resist the droplet attack. It was a pity that she couldn't have the nice ivory bone fan with a handle. I am the aide-de-camp of Archduke Franz. I'm responsible for the Grand Duke's daily life. Naturally, I have the right to enter the Grand Duke's room. Jenny spoke neither condescendingly nor condescendingly, but her tone was deliberately raised by 3 points. She still hoped that Franz would solve the problem. How do you prove your identity? Bordeaux walked around Jenny, trying to get some clues. Fortunately, Jenny was prepared, or Franz was prepared, and everyone had an identity certificate. Jenny took out her identity certificate, which was a photo taken with the latest photography technology at the time, which can be regarded as a unique certificate. Please look. Bordeaux took the certificate and looked at it carefully, then put his nose to it and smelled it. Jenny's expression was very bad. She didn't know what the guy in front of her wanted to do. After all, it was awarded by Archduke Franz himself, so there couldn't be any problem. Fake. Catch her and torture her. As soon as Bordeaux said this, everyone around him was dumbfounded. The two guards did not take action because they had received favor from Jenny before. You're talking nonsense. Jenny really couldn't stand it this time. She couldn't understand how someone could be so stupid as to use sniffing to identify the authenticity of documents. How can it be false that this certificate was issued by Archduke Franz himself? HMPH. Ignorant little thief. I will make you understand to death today. Bordeaux threw the ID to Jenny and stood in the middle of the door with his hands on his waist. Look how old you are. Jenny took a look, and she felt very happy when she was 17 and paired with that beautiful photo. After all, she put on makeup for several hours that day and took hundreds of photos to get such a photo. Favorite. What's wrong with being 17? Can't you look more mature? The 3 people opposite looked at Jenny's chest in unison, and the latter did not avoid it, but instead puffed up her chest confidently. Bordeaux slapped himself twice and said, "This is your biggest failure." Jenny was a little confused. Am I not prettier than I was at 17? No. Archduke Franz is only 12 years old this year. Miss Jenny became a chamberlain 6 years ago. How old were you 6 years ago? An 11-year-old girl entered the palace as a chamberlain? Do you think I'm an idiot? Is there any conspiracy behind your approach to Archduke Franz? If you don't tell me, I will definitely find 100 ways to make you confess everything. Jenny never thought that changing her age to 17 would cause such trouble. Bordeaux was proud of his carefulness, and the two guards on the side also sincerely admired their immediate superiors and looked forward to the 100 ways in the future. Seeing the 3 people slowly approaching her, Jenny was really embarrassed and annoyed. She suddenly showed a surprised expression. Archduke Franz, what's wrong with you? The 3 of them turned around subconsciously, and Jenny kicked the 2 guards in the crotch because their expressions just now were too obscene. Colonel Bordeaux saw 2 subordinates covering their crotches and slowly falling down, and immediately protected his lower body with both hands. Hey, I can't kick it anymore. Then he got a slap on the face. You dare to hit me? Jenny slapped her again. Her arm strength was very good due to years of training. By the time Franz heard the chaos outside and came out to check, Colonel Bordeaux had already been slapped into a pig's head. Protect the Grand Duke. Chapter 367 Public Opinion. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Colonel Bordeaux, who had been beaten into a pig's head in Franz's study, said vaguely, I'm Sorry, Miss Ajani, but your ID is really fake. Ajani raised her hand again, scaring Bordeaux and quickly hid aside. Mr. Bordeaux, please go to the infirmary for treatment first. Remember to close the door when you go out. Franz said. How can this be done? I'm your attendant, and my duty is to be responsible for your safety. Colonel Bordeaux covered his face and said vaguely. Franz was speechless about this new equerry, or captain of the bodyguard. Mr. Bordeaux, Miss Ajani and I have something to discuss. Please go out. This time, Colonel Bordeaux understood. He immediately turned around and went out. As soon as he went out, he poked his head back. Archduke Franz, Miss Ajani is very dangerous. She will. Ajani closed the door heavily and let out a sigh of relief. It seems your new colleagues are causing you trouble. Franz cheesed. It seems that your new attendant doesn't quite understand what you mean. Ajani choked back. The two looked at each other and smiled. How is the public opinion outside now? Franz asked. Don't you read the newspaper? Ajani asked. That kind of thing is castrated here and there, so it's okay not to look at it. Franz replied. It's much more serious than imagined. Not only does the military support it, but the streets and alleys of the city are talking about starting a war. Many people are preparing to join the army after Christmas, or sign up to be conscripts, and weapon stores have been emptied out. There are also many Germans who came to Vienna from other countries and prepared to join the army here to fight in Luxembourg. What about the rest of the empire? Everyone except the St. Stephen's Crown territory is actively preparing for war, and the Hungarians are also recruiting troops. However, there are rumors that they have been bribed by the French and are preparing to attack Vienna from behind. When the war begins, Pressburg's garrison has been increased to 80,000 troops to prepare for possible crisis. Marshal Radetzky of northern Italy blocked the mountain passes leading to Switzerland and concentrated his troops at the junction of Lombardy and the Kingdom of Sardinia. As a Polish, Ajani was not surprised by the behavior of the Hungarians. On the contrary, she felt a little bit like home. Old Mr. Kerda really gave a great gift to the entire German Confederation. Franz said with emotion that he really didn't expect that a small country and a group of small people could actually cause such a big thing. At this time, there was a surge of popularity in the German region, and other ethnic groups in the Austrian Empire also felt that it was a good opportunity to prove themselves, whether they were loyal to the empire or wanted to compete with the empire. In short, everyone wanted to have a fight. In fact, the Regent Council did not support the war. Prince Metternich and Count Korolov had a rare unanimous opinion. They both felt that this was not the time to launch a war. On the contrary, they should continue to hide their capabilities and bide their time. The military gave its own opinion. According to Count Turel's estimation, Austria does not need too many troops to take over the Netherlands. First of all, neither the Netherlands nor Belgium has a large number of standing troops, and most of the fortresses are in disrepair. The navies that the two countries are proud of pose no threat to the Austrian army. In addition, there are a large number of local civilian armed forces and civilians who cooperate with us. The guide only requires about 30,000 to 40,000 troops. In 2 months the Dutch will surrender as soon as they approach the city. The Belgians themselves are descendants of the Austrian Netherlands and should not choose to fight to the death with Austria. And this time we are sending troops in the name of the German Confederation. All states will send troops and provide us with supplies, so the Austrian Empire only needs to send 20,000 troops. Unlike the military's optimism, Prince Metternich expressed his concerns. This is simply a fool's errand. Behind the Netherlands and Belgium are Britain and France. Going to war with two great powers at the same time is tantamount to suicide. Do you think that if you send few troops to a war, you won't spend money? What will happen now to Austria's overseas trade and its colonies? If the other side blocks the Adriatic Sea, who will bear the losses? Do you know how many people died in Austria during the Napoleonic Wars? 550,000 people. Have you forgotten the bloody lesson again? I would rather have a mediocre peace than a glorious war. This is the prophecy left by Queen Issa. Count Korolov also fits the bill. Yes, this is a meaningless war. First of all, Luxembourg belongs to Prussia. Even if we liberate it, it will still belong to Prussia. Secondly, Can you rest assured that the logistics of our army are left to those who are just outsiders? It was obvious that Count Korolev did not trust those vassal states at all, and did not agree with this so-called Confederate war. The two princes of the royal family supported the war according to the instructions of the late emperor, without any reason. Archduke Louis felt that the people of Luxembourg were quite pitiful, and the old Coldray had deposited 120 million florins in the Frankfurt bank. Death is the most important thing, so this war can be regarded as a war to comfort the souls. Old Calder suffered a heart attack after the meeting, because he was too excited, and died at the age of 83. Even more ridiculous than this is Archduke Franz Karel, who is teasing the hyena seal he brought back from the Arctic, and does not want to explain why he agreed to this war. Although the hyena seal looks cute, it is also a 70-kilogram beast. When Prince Metternich tried to persuade the Archduke to talk business, the hyena squealed and then punched itself in the stomach. This weird creature frightened His Highness the Prince, but made everyone laugh. After all, seals are quite cute. At this time, Count Tyrrell gave his opinion. Your Highness, look at this beast in the Grand Duke's arms. Does it sound like a man beating a war drum when he beats his belly? This is God's will, Austria's destiny. This stupid war must be stopped. It may plunge the entire country into a state of catastrophe. Prince Metternich said stubbornly. Indeed, it will destroy the peace in Europe. We need peace now. As long as we are given another 20 years, there must be other ways to solve the problem. Count Korolev said desperately. Your Highness, please look out the window. Count Tyrrell walked to the window, opened the window, and drew the curtains. The dazzling sunlight shines into the house, followed by public opinion like a roaring mountain and a tsunami. Get rid of the Dutch dogs, down with Belgium, liberate Luxembourg. People took to the streets and shouted war. Austria had not fought a war for too long. Many people did not know the horror of war. At this time, the great German ideology, nationalism, and loyalty to the emperor and patriotic education converged into a torrent. The surging public opinion gathered into an irresistible torrent, and Metternich even suspected that, if he opposed supporting Luxembourg now, the tragedy of the French riots would immediately repeat itself. The Austrian Empire called the French Revolution a riot or insurrection. Chapter 368 Vertical and Horizontal Combination. Prussia, Berlin. William IV supported the unification of Germany. Although he personally opposed Austria's joining, he was still very pleased to be able to lead the war for Germany at this time and to get help from the Austrian Empire. Yes, the Prussian court was full of junker nobles at this time. Their brain circuits were different from those of ordinary politicians, and they were optimistic about this war. After all, Belgium only had 20,000 troops, and the Netherlands only had 3 troops in the country. 40,000 people. At this time, Prussia had a standing army of 200,000 people. Coupled with the high Civil War sentiment, many people were willing to join the army. Even if general mobilization was not carried out, there would be no problem in recruiting another 200,000 troops on the Austrian side. The standing army alone has 420,000 people. When combined with the total military strength of other states, it can even exceed the number of people in Napoleon's expedition to Russia. With an army of 1 million against the Belgian and Dutch coalition forces of less than 100,000, and there are still big cracks within the coalition, it will be easy to win. While the palace was toasting in celebration, far away in a manor in Latin America, Bismarck slammed the wine glass to the ground, and scattered glass flew all over the room. A bunch of idiots. Stupid pigs. They will destroy Prussia and the German Confederation. In Bismarck's eyes, this war was completely a manifestation of madness, and he knew very well where Britain's bottom line was. That is the Low Countries. Once this red line is touched, the UK will definitely not sit idly by. As for the French, that stupid King Louis Philippe is like a puppet to the English. Including Guizot, the leading figure in French politics at this time, was also a lackey of the British, and was short-sighted to the point of stupidity. The German Confederation was simply a mess, and there were countless pro-British and pro-French factions in it. If a war really broke out between the two sides, the German Confederation would probably collapse from within. Once the greedy Russians in the East see that the German Confederation is weak, they will definitely take advantage of it. By then, both the pro-British and pro-French factions, as well as Austria and Prussia, will be in a desperate situation. Maybe the German Confederation will be dissolved, like the Holy Roman Empire. The German Customs Union, the organization that allows Germans to live a good life, may also be abolished. All he can do now is to mobilize people, to build fortifications in his hometown, to reduce the impact of the Russians when they arrive. It is best to keep the Russians out before the negotiations are concluded. This can be regarded as a contribution to Prussia. Russia, St. Petersburg. Nicholas I got the news that the German Confederation was going to regain territory for its members, and the foreign minister also got the news. As a pro-British faction, Nassau said excitedly, "Your Majesty, this is an excellent opportunity to prove that we are the most trustworthy ally of the British Empire." Nicholas I's expression did not change at all as he sat on the throne. He just looked at the report, but his hands were trembling. According to the bureaucrats in the palace, Russia will rule the world as long as it can join forces with Britain. However, can that really be achieved? Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Although the public sentiment outside was turbulent, there was a peaceful and tranquil scene inside the palace. The lavishly decorated Christmas tree, the busy palace people as usual, and the scent of spices and fried carp floating in the air at this time. Austrian Christmas meals do not eat beef, pigs, chickens and other meats, because Catholics are not allowed to eat meat on Christmas Eve. Seafood and fish are not considered meat. Just think like modern fooders. Is this the country being kidnapped by its citizens? Franz thought. This is not what he wants. Ignorance, brutality, and even a little stupid unity are like a Pandora's box. Although it contains hope, it also contains countless monsters and monsters. Since the empire is a big river and public opinion is a torrent, then Franz can be the sluice. Franz is not prepared to rely on this kind of power. The Austrian Empire should still bring the battlefield to areas it is familiar with. There is not only one way to fight the war, some undead methods will be more effective. You look a little tired, Prime Minister. Franz looked at the old man in front of him who was known as the European Prime Minister. Although Metternich is 69 years old, he is still very energetic in the political arena and has to argue with Count Korolev for at least 4 hours every day. But at this time, Metternich seemed to have aged dozens of years in a day. His eyes were sunken and haggard, and he seemed to be sweating coldly. Archduke Franz, you should do everything you can to prevent this war, the old Prime Minister said hoarsely, and Franz shook his head in response. Do you know Louis XVI? He supported the American War of Independence, but he was guillotined by his own people. Now that the empire is following the path taken by the French, Luxembourg may become Austria's Achilles heel. At this time, the empire's economy is developing healthily, but a war can destroy everything. The fruits of reform, the happiness of the people, the wealth of the empire. Metternich spoke hoarsely, but Franz remained unmoved. Prime Minister, you are old. Austria is not France, my uncle is not Louis XVI, and you are not the self-righteous Marquis de Lafayette. You are Metternich, the Prime Minister of Europe. Luxembourg also belongs to Europe. European affairs must of course be resolved by Europeans. Metternich seemed to understand something, but seemed to understand nothing. But he understood that the little adult in front of him already had a solution. Your Excellency, Prime Minister, there once was an era called the Warring States period in the Far East. There were 7 powerful countries collectively called the 7 heroes of the Warring States period. Among them, Qin was the most powerful and wanted to unify the Central Plains by force. But at this time, a man named Sukin stood up and lobbied the 6 countries to jointly resist Qin. In the end, he returned to his hometown with the seal of the 6 countries and made Qin Kai dare not leave Hangzhou Pass for 15 years. That was the first Eastern Prime Minister. Although it was 2000 years later, his approach is still worth learning from. Franz's words have made it very clear. Metternich is not a fool. Of course he understands what it means, but he has no idea how to do it. Belgium was the breaking point. Belgium, but behind it are Britain and France. This alliance is so powerful that other European countries may not be able to defeat it even if they unite. Metternich followed Franz's train of thought, but soon reached a dead end. Britain and France are not monolithic. It is true that they both have interests in Belgium, But France wants to do business with Belgium and the local French-speaking residents, while Britain just wants Belgium to serve as a fortress to ensure its security point. And although France is a constitutional monarchy, Louis Philippe's power is not small. His Majesty the King is not a person who can withstand pressure. At the same time, he is a villain who is unjust and unjust. We can take advantage of this. Chapter 369. Combining vertical and horizontal. London, England. The British are very optimistic. Whether it is Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne, Palmerston, or even the moody Lord John Russell, they all feel that Austria and Prussia are seeking their own death. In the end, they will have to cede territory, pay compensation, and write a review fate. Even the British Colonial Secretary Constantine Phipps and the Marquis of Normandy began to prepare for matters related to taking over Austria's overseas colonies. Due to some changes in history, the Whigs are still in power and Robert Peel and his Tories have not yet come to power. In fact, he had done relevant research before. The colonies in Africa were easy to solve, but the trouble lay in East Africa and Asia. After all, Tanzania was given to Austria by the Oman Empire. If Britain rashly enters the region, it may cause dissatisfaction with the East African overlord. The Austrian colonies in the Mekong River basin are full of fanatical religious atmosphere. The British have penetrated them several times but failed. They have also kidnapped some Chinla workers, but no one said anything, even if they were tortured to death. No more than a little bit of useful information was produced. What's even more terrifying is that Austria has established many arsenals locally, supplying arms throughout Southeast Asia. Fanatic believers have mastered advanced weapons. There is nothing more terrifying than this. It's so stupid. The damned Vienna system and the rotten Austrian Empire are in their graves, said Palmerston. The collapse of the Austrian Empire will inevitably arouse Russia's ambition to advance westward. We should not weaken it too much, otherwise it will have a negative impact on our British hegemony. Perhaps we should warn Russia not to have ambitions in the German region. John Russell was already thinking about the international situation after the war, but his approach still aroused Palmerston's dissatisfaction. Why warn the Russians first? Wouldn't it be better to let them kill and rob? The more chaotic Europe is, the safer we will be. If the Russians like to fight, let them fight. We can even promise the Russians that we will give them Poland and we in the UK can solve the problem without even sending troops. Palmerston's intention is to let the Russians work for nothing and finally bring the Russians along. This naturally resonated with everyone, and Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne also said the same. That's right. Louis Philippe is also a very good person. He lets Russia and France fight against the Prussian and Austrian groups. At that time, we in the UK can sell weapons and supplies to both sides. This will not only allow the mainland to continue to maintain the balance of power, but also it will take our UK strength to the next level. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister is wise. The horses of the cabinet members were delivered in time. They all knew what kind of fool Louis Philippe was. As long as they acquiesced in his annexation of Luxembourg, they were willing to lose all their overseas colonies. The German Confederation actually has this benefit. We should really give a medal to the old member of parliament Calder of Luxembourg. Viscount Melbourne continued to joke. What a nice Christmas gift. There was a cheerful atmosphere in the British cabinet. Palmerston knew very well how to deal with Nasrallah and Gizet. What Russia wanted was to become an ally with Britain, while the French wanted to establish a Franco-Belgian customs union. It doesn't matter, agree first, and when they fight until both sides suffer, Britain will take action. It will deal with France first, because it has a large number of overseas colonies, and its huge benefits can convince those timid domestic lawmakers. After France is solved, we can then deal with Russia, the enemy of civilization. By the time these two battles were over, the national strength of Prussia and Austria would have been almost exhausted. He could already imagine the four countries groveling at the London Peace Conference. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz and Metternich's long conversation was not over yet. You mean to start with France? Metternich was a little incredulous, but seemed to have thought of something. Yes, the British will also go to France. After all, the French are stupid and greedy, and they are the easiest to be fooled. But we can also take advantage of this, and let them work for us. Franz said. But King Leopold I of Belgium is the son-in-law of Louis Philippe. He married Princess Louise Mary thès Charlotte Isabelle d'Orléans of France. Their children will inherit Belgium in the future. The throne, Metternich said with concern, that King Leopold I of Belgium was both an in-law of the British royal family and an in-law of the French royal family, which was very difficult to handle. But it was a product of the revolution, and Louis Philippe didn't want to wait that long. Spain was so big that he had to wait, and Belgium was just a small country point. If it was so easily available, I think Louis Philippe would not mind letting Princess Louise and her husband continue to live in Wallonia, France. Franz believes that greed can easily defeat human nature, especially when the benefits are large enough. How can his daughter's happiness compare to the great achievements of himself and his family? Give Wallonia to France in exchange for concessions from France. Metternich finally understood what Franz meant, but he didn't seem to fully understand point. But Franz didn't want to continue pursuing such a trivial matter, but said directly, yes, the Belgian province of Wallonia is predominantly French-speaking, which is why the French have always coveted this place. In order to win over France, wouldn't it be better to hand over Flemish to them as well? Moreover, the lowlands have always been a restricted area for the British. After France obtains Flemish, there will never be peace between Britain and France. Metternich gradually caught up with Franz's ideas, but he was a little too radical or too naive. It is good to let France swallow up Belgium too, so relations between Britain and France, but there are too many loopholes, and the benefits are too great, which will make the other side suspicious. Although France had many conflicts with Britain at this time, there were not many high-level people on both sides who really wanted to fight. Metternich could see this move, and naturally some people in Britain and France could also see it. Your Excellency, Prime Minister, our Austrian Empire should be the party that maintains order, and if we want to be in harmony with the 6 countries, how can we do without the Netherlands? We can return the Flemish Kingdom of Belgium to the Netherlands. As for the contradiction between Catholicism and Protestantism, our Austrian Empire can accept those marginalized Catholics. Anyway, Austria has a lot of land. If they don't want to stay in Austria, they can seek development in overseas colonies. Moreover, the Dutch have long been dissatisfied with Belgium's independence. The British can drill a hole in the Vienna system, and we can also fill it. The British want to destroy our system and establish their own system. If Austria always avoids fighting, the other side will take advantage of it. If we want to maintain our order, we must pay a corresponding price. Likewise, if they want to disrupt order, they must pay a price. Only in this way can the Anglo-Saxons feel more at ease. Metternich was very surprised. It was hard for him to imagine that this was a plan that a 12-year-old child could come up with, but perhaps only children could be so naive. Chapter 370 Christmas Eve. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. This is the 12th Christmas that Franz has spent with his family. The old father doesn't like Franz's wine because it has no taste, but he still insists on drinking it. Mrs. Sophie has become obsessed with cosmetics. Even at Christmas, she is studying the art of cosmetics. However, she will not experiment on herself. Those beautiful ladies in the past are her canvas. Before those young and beautiful girls entered the palace, they had more or less heard some rumors about Madame Sophie. Legend has it that she liked to sink people to the bottom of the Danube River, or skin them and convulse them, or eat their hearts alive. However, in the eyes of these maids, Mrs. Sophie is a beauty. Not only is she beautiful, but she also helps them dress up, and is also very kind-hearted. A maid is a low-level servant in the palace. In fact, most of the maids in the palace are from noble families, but there will always be some seniors in the palace who remind them from time to time to pay attention to etiquette in front of Mrs. Sophie. Otherwise it will not be solved by saying sorry. It's just that these new maids don't care. Most of them believe that they are young and beautiful, and many of them are even pursuing the ideas of a few young princes. After all, there are countless messy things like finding a lover or one night stand in Europe. Moreover, the eldest Archduke Franz is already 12 years old, and Archduke Maximilian is already 10 years old, and they are almost old enough to choose a health nurse. Although they now have female attendants around them, one of them is of unknown origin, and the other is too old, and the special status of healthcare worker is not usually retained in the palace. Point of course, if you can stay in the palace, you will have a high status, maybe even like Madame Pompadour in France. Madame Pompadour was the most trusted lover, playmate, and advisor of Louis XV, the navigator of Rococo art, the patron of Enlightenment literature, the driving force behind the French Oriental craze, and the discoverer of everyday beauty. However, in the eyes of many people, she was just a whore lady and the main culprit in the decline of France. She is a woman who is truly famous and slandered all over the world. It's unlikely, but who hasn't dreamed of it? Back to the main story. Maximilian did not like Franz, the eldest brother. After all, without the latter, the former would be the heir to the empire, at least he thought. So as for Franz's third brother Ludwig, I have to say that he was a very hard-working person. Even on Christmas Eve he was studying. So Franz simply gave him a box of exercise books as a Christmas gift. Workbooks were the first creation of Franz. The first workbooks in history were invented in 1905 by an Italian tutor who couldn't bear it. But at this time, Franz brought this kind of thing to the world more than 60 years in advance in order to let the children of this era feel the suffering he had experienced. However, what Franz could not have imagined was that experts and professors from all walks of life were full of praise for this approach and followed suit one after another. It only makes students throughout Austria miserable. Ludwig was quite happy to receive a large box of exercise books. He felt that this was a kind of encouragement and expectation from his elder brother. Thank you. This is really the best gift. I will definitely try my best to live up to my big brother's expectations of me. Franz just patted his third brother on the shoulder. He did have some expectations for Ludwig, but he didn't expect him to be very good. He just wanted to avoid any awkwardness when deciding which princess to marry or inheriting the throne of a certain king in the future. Just fine. Yes, Franz's younger brothers and sisters are actually political assets, especially for Austria, an ancient bloodline empire. Of course, this also includes Franz's sister Maria and Victor in his arms. While they enjoy the rights of being born into an imperial family, they also need to fulfill some due obligations. Victor Joseph Anton was born in 1842 and was Franz's youngest brother. Historically, because Mrs. Sophie's only daughter died in infancy, she doted on Victor excessively. However, the love imposed by an overly strong mother was not so easy to accept, which caused Victor to become emotionally disturbed and dislike women, but instead began to like men. Due to too many scandals in history, Franz had to drive his brother out of Vienna to prevent him from continuing to ruin the family's reputation. However, at this time, Mrs. Sophie had both children, and the building had been crooked since Franz, which made the subsequent children very difficult to discipline. At the same time, Franz has been looking for things for Madame Sophie to prevent her from interfering too much in politics, so Mrs. Sophie simply let it go and ignored her children. Of course, this was also the trend of the upper class society at this time. Franz's sister took on the responsibility of taking care of Victor. Of course, most of the time she just made trouble for the nuns. Franz naturally also prepared a gift for his sister, but this time it was not a devilish gift like an exercise book. But when Franz walked over, little Maria pouted and hugged little Victor to her chest. Let me tell you in advance, I don't need exercise books or anything like that. My mother has agreed that I don't need to go to school. I just need to be literate and understand etiquette. Franz shook his head. This is not good. How can you do it without learning or skills? You won't even know if you are deceived in the future. We can't always protect you like this. You will have to rely on yourself one day. You don't have to go to school, but you will always have to hire a tutor. At worst, we will hire a dozen tutors for you and let them take turns educating you. Don't listen, little Maria made a face. She didn't like to be preached to by others, including Franz, but Franz would not let her do whatever she wanted. After all, she might be the one who got hurt in the end. Franz raised his hand, and little Maria was so frightened that she immediately shrank behind the Christmas tree. But Franz didn't plan to teach her a lesson on Christmas Eve, but instead said it differently. Actually, school is not a scary place. My sister is so smart and beautiful. She must be like a little star on campus and make people jealous. Franz reached out and rubbed Maria's golden hair. It was very soft, but the color made him feel awkward. Of course, Nana says I'm smart. So does Monica. Gallia Maria held her head up proudly, then lowered her head and counted the names of her friends. There are not only teachers in the school, but also many children about your age. When the time comes, you will have many friends to play hide and seek with you, play swings with you, and pile sand with you. Really? Maria couldn't wait to interrupt Franz. She lacked everything, but she didn't have many playmates of the same age. Even if she did, it would take a long time to see one. After all, everyone was princesses in different countries. Really? When did brother lie to you? Franz looked like a grey wolf who had caught a sheep, but Maria didn't notice it. Then, I'll go tomorrow, Maria shouted excitedly. It's Christmas holiday, and Maria, everyone expects you to be smart and beautiful. Franz said seductively. Maria is the smartest and the most beautiful. Maria looked unconvinced. At this time Franz took out an exquisite box. A Christmas present for you, little. Maria approached the box cautiously. After all, Franz often said that a soldier never tires of deceit, and then attacked her in various ways. He was very cunning. Who knew if it was another trap this time? Even when opening the box, little Maria called a maid to help open it. After all, she was afraid that there would be a spring monster inside, or something like snakes and bugs. However, there was nothing strange in the box, but an exquisite little crown. Franz knew his sister very well, and she liked those bright gems just like ordinary girls. He simply used diamonds dug out of Namibia, real rubies and sapphires, gold from California and silver from Tyrol to create a rather exquisite little crown for his sister. The crown was made of high quality silver, gold, 25 pigeon bloodstones, and 360 diamonds. What Franz didn't know was that the crown he made was quite luxurious among the entire European royal family. Later, this also attracted a lot of jealous or envious looks for my sister, as well as some unnecessary trouble. But at this time, little Maria was still very happy when she saw this little crown, and she hurriedly put it on her head. Thank you, brother. Do you look more beautiful wearing this little crown? Franz asked. Maria looked in the mirror and nodded with great satisfaction. Isn't this more enviable? Franz asked again. Yes, Maria answered affirmatively. Then, if you ask an excellent tutor to teach you, will you be smarter in the future? Franz continued to ask. Yes, Maria answered affirmatively. If you were smarter and more beautiful, wouldn't everyone like you more? Franz smiled brightly. Yes, Maria said innocently. Then, brother, can you hire a tutor who can satisfy you? Franz asked. Yeah. Maria nodded. No regrets. Never regret it. The two siblings high-fived each other, and then Maria took Victor and ran all the way to her mother to show off her baby brother. Wherever Maria goes, I will go too. Ludwig interrupted. Go to hell. Franz slapped the other person on the head. What? Ludwig was a little confused. His intelligence was that of his recent father, and he was the one in the family who really needed protection. Maria went to an all-girls school. Oh. Ludwig looked understanding, and then said, wouldn't it be better if I went to a boys' school? The girls' school is run by our family. There is no boys' school. Do you see me going to school? No. Stay at home and ask your attendants to go to the university to learn what you want to learn. Oh. Ludwig looked disappointed, but what he didn't know was that not just anyone could invite those top-notch professors to their homes to teach. Chapter 371 German Confederate Volunteers. Brussels, Belgium. King Leopold I was a hero. After he received the news that the German Confederation was going to come forward for Luxembourg liberation, he did not go home for Christmas like the stupid ministers at home and pinned all his hopes on Luxembourg, on the British and the French. Mr. Norton, I'm really sorry that you are here to discuss state affairs on Christmas Eve, but we cannot place our hopes entirely on the British and French. If we Belgians want to stand among the nations of the world, we must rely on ourselves. Jane Baptist. Norton was the Prime Minister of Belgium at this time, and he was also a far-sighted politician. It was under his and King Leopold I's governance that Belgium became the most promising country in Europe. One of the countries. Your Majesty, you are right. Zulang and the others lack foresight. They think they can rest easy by relying on the British and French, and they do not even prepare for nationwide mobilization. I support you, Leopold. I nodded his thanks. Mr. Norden, please see that our Luxembourg province is located in the Ardennes. It has a dense network of internal rivers and numerous hills and forts. It is not easy for the Austrian, Prussian, and German Confederate armies to break through point, and they will not only recapture Western Luxembourg, the Netherlands is also their target. Maybe they are also ready to fight the British and French. We cannot take it lightly. After listening to His Majesty the King's words, Jean-Baptiste Nodin couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. He did not expect that things would develop to this point. If that were the case, it would be a reenactment of the Napoleonic Wars, and I really don't know how many people would have died. You are right. The German Confederate Army will most likely bypass the Ardennes and break through our defense line from the confluence of the Meuse and Ourthe rivers. Leopold. I was an all-rounder. He could not only govern the country and develop the economy, but also lead troops to fight. It's just that his abilities in the first two are so outstanding that people always forget that this king is also a hero who is about to conquer the world. Liège. That's right. This will become the battlefield for a decisive battle with the German Confederacy. Jean-Baptiste Norden suddenly thought that, as soon as Leopold I came to power, he built a military camp in Liège the following year, and stationed 2,000 troops there. Of course, many people objected, but His Majesty the King overcame all objections. I really didn't expect that at that time. His Majesty the King had already thought of this possibility in the future. Your Majesty, you are so far-sighted. Prime Minister Jean-Baptiste Norden said sincerely. We have 1,500 people in the West Luxembourg area and 2,000 people in Liège. We will now send the main force to Liège to strengthen local defense point. At the same time, recruits were recruited from various places and sent to West Luxembourg. We must be prepared for everything. If we can hold on for 2 or 3 months, they will have to give up point even without the help of Britain and France. We must defend our homeland. Your Majesty is wise. Jean-Baptiste Nodin said sincerely. How soon can we complete the deployment? In about a month. We still need to buy enough weapons and equipment, clothing and food. Jean-Baptiste Nodin was telling the truth. In fact, Belgium's independence did not rely on force, but on general trends. In addition, the Netherlands did not rely on a spectrum of opponents. No, it's too slow. These arrangements must be completed within a week. We must complete the deployment before the arrival of the German Confederate Army. According to Leopold I's estimation, it would take several months for big countries like Austria and Prussia to complete their mobilization point. Even if the standing army is used, it is impossible to reach Luxembourg within a week. Luxembourg's army of hundreds of militiamen has no combat effectiveness at all. Belgium and Luxembourg are also old rivals and know each other very well. However, in fierce battles between the two sides, civilians often suffer the most casualties. As for the reason, it's very complicated. In short, it's the word Poil family hates. Netherlands, Amsterdam Royal Palace. King William II of the Netherlands was as weak as his father. He was afraid that the German Confederation would attack the Netherlands, and he was even more afraid that the British would abandon him. Before the war even started, the Dutch Supreme Head of State was already preparing to surrender, although the British government has repeatedly stated that it will protect the rights and interests of the Netherlands and require it to resist. But how could the Dutch, who had been sold to the British more than once, believe this? The envoy of King William II of the Netherlands has already gone to Vienna. With such a king around, the Dutch ministers are naturally not prepared to fight to the end. They have not even recalled the strongest troops of the Netherlands, nor have they mobilized. As the world's first capitalist country, the people of the Netherlands have long been indifferent to politics. They care more about their wages and whether they will have food to eat tomorrow. As for the king, the country, the government, what is that? Let them go to Asia to rob, and these people will not look back, because there is money to be made. But asking them to fight tooth and nail for other people's things? Even if the prince personally leads the expedition, they just fire off a few guns and go through the motions, as long as they can live up to their wages. In the history of the Dutch 10-day invasion, the Dutch prince led his army to attack Belgium. Although it was claimed to have destroyed the Belgian army, it did not cause many casualties. As for the most powerful liberals and conservatives in the Netherlands, they do not want to fight. On the contrary, they actually envy organizations like the German Customs Union and the German Confederation. After all, they can make money and have people providing protection, which can greatly improve their living standards. The liberals are mainly composed of businessmen, urban middle school scholars, senior civil servants, etc., while the conservatives are composed of churches and aristocrats. In particular, businessmen groups have begun to send intelligence to the German Confederation. Some of them hope to obtain the concession rights of the German Customs Union, while others simply want to protect their assets. When the Netherlands is conquered, point this information, from soldiers, horses, money and food, to defense plans, and even such trivial details as the general's character and the number of people in his family, is clear. As for the European church and aristocrats, Lee can always have some connections. We are all relatives and friends. Is there anything we can't talk about? The war has not yet begun. From the king to the common people, no one has a fighting spirit, is either preparing for peace talks, or is preparing to defect. However, the situation quickly took a turn for the worse. The Dutch envoy had just arrived in Luxembourg, and the Austrian envoy was already waiting for him. After the two parties met, after just a simple conversation, the envoy of King William II of the Netherlands was almost shocked. He immediately decided to take the Austrian envoy to meet His Majesty the King in person, because the news was so shocking, and he felt that His Majesty the King would not believe it if he told it from his mouth. The Austrian envoy also anticipated this situation early on, and they got on the carriage to Amsterdam together. When passing through the center of Luxembourg, the Dutch envoy was once again so shocked that he almost fell off the carriage. He saw a dense mass of heavily armed soldiers gathering here under the banners of their respective countries. The flag erected in the center of the square is the Austrian flag, but there is a line of text on it, German. Confederate volunteers. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 372. Surprise or not? London, England. People in the Palace of Westminster who are going to Russia to contact Russia have also set off and are expected to arrive at the port of Hamburg in a few days. It's winter in the northern hemisphere, so you can't take a boat directly to St. Petersburg because the Baltic Sea will freeze. The Netherlands, Belgium, and France have all received letters of credence from the United Kingdom, and an alliance against the German Confederation has been formed. On the other hand, British factories that got the news were working hard to produce, and the prices of agricultural products rose by 30% within a few days. News constantly coming from Hanover also confirms that this gorgeous fireworks will definitely begin, and the British are ready to make a lot of money. However, this time the Rothschild family, the overlord of the financial world, did not make any big moves. They seem to be waiting for news from Vienna. For this missed opportunity, colleagues in the London financial community laughed at them as they were still living in the era of Napoleon. Lionel Rothschild had actually already received news that war might break out. However, his uncle Solomon Rothschild had repeatedly warned him before that if he faced the Austrian Empire, he must wait for news from Vienna. Lionel felt that his uncle was a great financier who had made huge profits countless times without spending a penny. When he was young, he has achieved great fame in the business and political circles on the European continent. Even his father did not dare to call himself a king. However, everyone in Vienna called him His Majesty the King. Even Prince Metternich asked him in front of him, "Keep your head down and do things." Although this uncle has been having bad luck in recent years, even if he made money, he exchanged precious metals for Austrian banknotes. In the end, it was difficult to tell whether he was making money or losing money, but Lionel was still willing to believe him. However, other members of the family could no longer sit still and started some investments one after another. They even contacted chili and saltpeter merchants and prepared to increase the price of this commodity around the world. Although Lionel knew all this, he did not stop it. After all, he did not want to put all his eggs in one basket. Moreover, the rumors that became increasingly true made him unable to sit still. Queen Victoria didn't care about politics, because as she grew older, she found that all politicians disliked her and all they wanted was power, and she also found the love of her life, Prince Albert, and at this time, a letter asking for help written by her uncle King Leopold I of Belgium was placed on her desk. Victoria didn't even open it and sent it to the cabinet. Because there was not much emotion in the letter, and it was more of a political meaning, so leave it to those politicians. Prince Albert was an attentive man, and he noticed some changes in Victoria's expression. "What's wrong, my angel? You seem to have something on your mind." Victoria leaned forward and kissed Prince Albert's broad chest, then took a firm bite. "I'm thinking, what should I do if one day you don't love me anymore?" Albert stroked Victoria's long hair and said in a gentle tone, "My angel, what are you worrying about? How could this happen? I will always love you." "Then prove it." Victoria pouted. "Come again. This is the 5th time tonight," Albert shouted, but soon saw something wrong in Victoria's eyes. December 30th, 1842, the 5th day after Christmas, Brussels, Belgium. Leopold I received another new message. "Your Majesty the King, the Dutch are preparing for war across the country. The total number is likely to exceed 100,000. A minister reported anxiously. "What's the hurry? This is a good thing. The more troops the Dutch have, the more they can share our pressure. Although we are not allied, we do have a common enemy." But before Leopold I could finish his words, he was interrupted by the minister. "According to reports from our lurking people in Amsterdam, the Dutch seem to have sent troops." This time it was Leopold I who interrupted the minister. "Isn't that a good thing? They are coming to Brussels," the minister replied intermittently. "What damn idiot. Are you still trying to take advantage of the situation?" Leopold I was really shocked and angry at this time. He really couldn't find the words to describe the stupidity of King William II of the Netherlands, who was simply worse than his father William I, with the German Confederation on one side and the Dutch on the other. This was truly a moment of crisis, because Leopold I had previously transferred troops from Brussels to reinforce the fortresses of West Luxembourg and Liège. There were only some new soldiers in Brussels at this time point, but he was worthy of being a hero, and he immediately decided to personally lead the army to stop the Dutch. Leopold I believed that the German Confederate army would not give up the opportunity to attack the internally weak Netherlands at the same time. Leopold I sent someone to deliver a message to the UK again. This time he thought that the other party would send troops to rescue them anyway. After all, a strong and complete Netherlands was not in the interests of the UK. Netherlands plus Belgium equals Netherlands. In fact, theoretically speaking, Leopold I's views and actions were correct. Belgium was still very enthusiastic about fighting the Dutch. In just one day, the newly recruited army and temporary police force were assembled and headed to the front under the command of Leopold I. However, not long after leaving the city, they collided head-on with a team wearing a flag similar to this on the outskirts of Leuven. It seemed that the Belgian flag had been adjusted, but something seemed wrong. Leuven, a city west of Brussels, a traffic artery. The Belgian flag and the German Confederation flag are both composed of 3 colors, black, red, and gold. If you put the German Confederation flag up, it will be the Belgian flag, and vice versa. The flag of the German Confederation was designed in 1818. Since the German Confederation had little sense of existence, its flag had even less sense of existence. At that time, the flag was also associated with liberals, so it was abandoned historically. King Leopold I did not know all this. He thought it was a defeated army on the front line. Therefore, Leopold I made a judgment as quickly as possible, and he wanted to go to the front to see the situation in person. As a result, King Leopold I of Belgium rushed towards the opposite team with a dozen trusted cavalrymen. King Leopold I was furious when he saw these soldiers were neatly dressed, well equipped, and talking and laughing. "Whose army is this? Call your commander out." The soldiers looked at the high official running over and couldn't help but burst into laughter listening to the somewhat awkward German. Leopold I was even more angry when he saw this. "In this time of national crisis, don't you have any sense of shame?" The soldiers suddenly became solemn after hearing this. At this time, a man who looked like an officer came over on horseback. "May I ask you are your king?" Leopold, I said with a bit of sullenness and a bit of pride point. As soon as this statement came out, all the soldiers were dumbfounded, including the officer. About 10 seconds later, the officer said, "Your Majesty the King, you have been captured. We are the First Army of the German Confederate Volunteer Army Advanced Detachment, and our commander is Archduke Albrecht of Austria. Please disarm your troops, and I will take you to see His Excellency the Archduke." Chapter 373 Liege Fortress. 4 days ago, December 27th, 1842. Fortress of Liege, Belgium. This barracks is located at the confluence of the Meuse and Ourthe rivers, adjacent to the Dutch border to the north and the Ardennes forest to the south. It is an important transportation route and a natural pass, making it a must-do battle for military strategists. The news of the German Confederation's declaration of war has reached the fortress, but at this time the Belgian soldiers are still the same as usual, except that they no longer need to participate in training. Soldiers flocked to the river during the rare holiday, because if the news was true, they might not have a chance to take a bath for weeks or even months in the future. The soldiers were still taking a bath, and several workers responsible for cleaning up nearby dumped truckloads of excrement and filth into the river. "Hey, what are you doing? Didn't you see that we are still taking a bath? This water is not even suitable for drinking, let alone taking a bath." The soldiers immediately became angry when they saw the workers' unreasonable behavior, but the latter said calmly, "This is what General Georgian ordered. It is a meeting gift for Austria and Prussia. This is so disgusting." One soldier said, covering his nose, "This is what we want. What do you think those guys will do if the river water becomes undrinkable?" The foreman asked. "Dig a well?" A soldier asked tentatively. "No, those officers who find it troublesome always let the soldiers drink it directly. They don't care about the life and death of their subordinates. Then dysentery and typhoid will break out in their army. Then they will surrender without us fighting." The foreman had a look of admiration on his face. Although the soldiers thought this trick was a bit damaging, it seemed very practical and effective. Anyway, they were not the ones who died, so they laughed. At this time, the earth trembled, and the birds were frightened out of the forest. "Something's coming. Get dressed quickly." "What exactly? A grizzly bear? A wolf pack?" The workers and soldiers immediately prepared to retreat in the direction of the military camp. However, they were soon overtaken by a cavalry unit. The other party saw that, although they were wearing Belgian military uniforms, they had no weapons, and did not embarrass them. "Ah, you soldiers from the Liege fortress?" the leading officer said in blunt Dutch. He was afraid that these people would not understand, so he said it again in French. The surrounded Belgians nodded like garlic. They didn't know whether the other party was German, Dutch, or French. But without weapons, they had no chance of winning against so many well-equipped cavalry. "How many of you are there?" "2 regiments, 2,100 people in total." "Why aren't you in the barracks today?" The general said there was no need for training, so we sneaked out to take a shower. "Besides the 150 of you, how many others ran out? There will be a war in a while, so the officers have gone to the Moonlight Castle in the city to relax in the past few days. We people have no one to supervise us, so there is no need to stick to our posts." The Belgian soldiers said with a bit of resentment and a bit of self-blame. "We are the advance team of the First Army of the German Confederate Volunteers. You can go and persuade the defenders in the barracks to surrender. If you succeed, you will not only avoid unnecessary casualties, but also get a reward of 10,000 florins. Otherwise, we will be in 2 hours. We will launch an attack later, and by then it will be too late for you to surrender." The one who spoke was Archduke Albrecht himself. He knew one truth very well, that is, the speed of war is important. At this time, the troops in the Liege fortress were empty, and it was a good time to make a big move. Once the fortress of Liege was captured, the road to Brussels was smooth sailing. The 5,000 men led by Albrecht were Franz's Royal Dragoons and his family's guard, as well as 1,000 elite troops drawn from various Viennese forces. The weapon he carries is the latest Siege M42 rocket developed by the Austrian Empire. The explosive power of this rocket may not be enough, but it is an excellent tool for destroying cities. General Vincenz, Austria's chief weapons designer, called it a city destroyer because the rocket has a large explosion range and contains a lot of combustibles inside, making the fire difficult to extinguish and easily destroying large wooden buildings. Burn point. Of course, this thing was actually used to burn ships. But during the test, it was found that it was too heavy and had a pitifully low hit rate, so it could not be used in maritime operations, so it became a siege rocket. Point. In fact, there are some high-performance bombs in the baggage train of Albrecht's team, which are dozens of times more powerful than black powder. However, the technology of this kind of picric acid explosive is not mature, and he does not want to sacrifice the lives of his soldiers unless he has to. The soldiers at Liege Fortress were very excited when they heard 10,000 florins, because this money was enough for them to spend the rest of their lives in other countries. However, before they could persuade their comrades to surrender, the garrison of the fortress surrendered. Point. The advance guard continued to advance, and Albrecht had to wait for subsequent reinforcement to consolidate the defense of Liege's fortress. After all, this is the lifeline of the German Confederate Volunteer Army. I have one last question. Who poured the dirty water into the river? Albrecht is usually a very generous person, but he is unexpectedly petty in some places at that time. Albrecht was just about to let his beloved horse drink some water so that he could continue on his way, when he saw a large amount of filth floating upstream. He immediately became furious and led the advance team to trace the source of the filth. Point. The Belgian prisoners pointed to the foreman. Let him eat all the filth in the river and tell the nearby residents that this person is polluting the water source. Albrecht ordered. Grand Duke, spare your life. General Georgian asked me to do it, and I was forced to do it. The foreman immediately begged for mercy. Where is General Georgian? Albrecht asked. At Moonlight Castle. He went with the officers in the fortress. The foreman betrayed the general without a second thought. Take him with you, and let's go find General Georgian. You all listen carefully. General Georgian ordered the water source to be polluted. You have to explain it clearly to the residents here. Do you hear me clearly? Albrecht shouted. Listen clearly. The captured Belgian soldiers nodded. Point. As a result, the advance team began to split up. Some of them continued to advance towards Brussels, while the other part went to capture General Georgian in Liège. Point. Albrecht still remembered Franz's model of the trial. Point. When they found General Georgian and his men, they were still immersed in the gentle land. Point. Soon these guys who polluted the water source were sent to the square in the center of the city, and then more black information was revealed. General Georgian was a disease enthusiast. He liked to see people getting sick, and then recorded his observations for fun. Point. This kind of person makes Albrecht feel disgusted, but he also knows very well that there are many such people in the world. So Albrecht left it in the square in the center of the city after the trial was completed. Point. Soon more volunteers were sent to the front along the railway lines within the German Confederacy. In just 3 days, more than 10,000 people were transported, a number that was unimaginable before. Point. After receiving reinforcement, Albrecht continued to advance, but he soon received news that he could not believe. Point. King Leopold I of Belgium was captured, and the city of Brussels was captured. Chapter 374. Eating a big bowl with tears. January 1st, 1843, New Year's Day. 10 Downing Street, London, UK. The whole of Belgium has fallen, and the Netherlands declares that it respects the territorial integrity of Luxembourg. These two important messages reached the UK at the same time, which shocked the cabinet members who were still enjoying their afternoon tea and almost spit out all the black tea they had drank. They immediately throwing away the cookies in his hand, he hurried to the Prime Minister's office to attend an emergency meeting. Damn it, that Wilhelm II really has no backbone at all. He was ready to surrender before a shot was fired. But what happened to Belgium? I have seen their Leopold I. This man is a tough guy and shouldn't be so quick. Just surrender. Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne said helplessly. It is said that he was unfortunately captured when he led his troops out of the city to fight against the German Confederate troops. Lord John Russell replied, "The King of the Netherlands is a timid, fearful waste with no foresight. We can no longer tolerate this. We must force him to go to war with the German Confederation. Palmerston suggested point at this time. Secretary of War John Seth raised a question. This is military common sense that politicians have ignored. Have you ever thought about how Austria and Prussia reached Belgium when the war started just a few days ago? Did they fly there? It's just that this most critical point has been ignored by politicians who are in no mood to discuss the minutiae of strategy and tactics. Okay, we don't have the time or energy to think about anything else. The first priority now is to urge the Dutch to hold on and resist to the end. We also need to contact the French to send troops to Wallonia so that those bastards of the German Confederation can tell what they are. A powerful enough threat. We must immediately promote a Franco-Dutch-Belgian alliance. Words cannot express the mood of Viscount Melbourne at this moment. He has already felt that the crisis is approaching. In less than a week, all of Belgium has fallen, which is really unexpected. Any news from Russia? Asked Palmerston. It's very unfortunate that it's winter now. If I think of St. Petersburg, I have to pass through Hamburg and Berlin first, and then take a half-month carriage ride. A cabinet member waved his hand helplessly. Damn it. Palmerston finally began to become impatient at this time, because he seemed to feel that he and Britain had become the prey of others. It seems that the Russians can no longer quench their thirst from far away, and now they can only place their hopes on the French point. In fact, there are other reasons why the British are unwilling to land in Europe. That is, they do not have enough troops to devote to land warfare. Moreover, the European war decades ago made everyone understand that the war with the great powers is a waste of time. The costs and losses are huge, and the losses outweigh the gains for any country. We can negotiate and resolve this crisis peacefully. John Russell proposed point. This is the best idea he can think of. After all, the situation is out of control at this time. It will take time for the United Kingdom to reverse the unfavorable situation, and this is the only way to go now. But now Pau has the advantage, so how can it possibly negotiate with us? Prime Minister Viscount Melbourne understood what John Russell meant, but the reason why Prussia and Austria were able to capture Belgium in a short time must have been planned for a long time. Point. Now that Belgium is occupied, the Netherlands has promised to make concessions, and Prussia and Austria have achieved their set goals. What they have to do at this time is to end the war and force the other party to sign a city alliance, rather than resolve the dispute through words. No, I think they will accept this proposal, because in order to end the war, they need our recognition. In other words, as long as we do not sign the contract, this war will not end. Palmerston expressed his inner views with great certainty. He believed in the influence of Britain at the moment, and believed in his own judgment even more. Others also felt that what Palmerston said was indeed reasonable. And then another piece of good news came. France has decided to send troops. A cabinet member shouted excitedly. Historically, it was the French who sent troops to scare away the Dutch and allow Belgium to gain real independence. At this time, France decided to send troops, and it must have been prepared to fight to the end with the German Confederation. The cabinet members all analyzed this. The London stock market soared the next day, and businessmen celebrated like crazy. Even Lionel Rothschild, who had previously stood still, began to make big moves. The machines in the world's factories began to spin at full speed. Faced with an overwhelming number of orders, factory owners raised workers' wages to prepare for a share of the feast that followed. France, Paris, Palais d'Oileau. As Louis Philippe frowned upon the envoy from Vienna. Does your country want me to usurp my son-in-law's territory? No, just take him under your protection. The new Grand Duchy of Belgium will have only French-speaking inhabitants who will accept French law and be led by you and your son-in-law. Johann von Weissenborn briefly served as Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire, but at this time he was only a little-known diplomat. Although Louis Philippe was very unhappy on the surface, he was relieved in his heart. The speed of the opponent's advance is surprising, and their occupation of Belgium has an extra layer of meaning. This land used to be called the Austrian Netherlands, and Louis Philippe's previous hesitation was due to fear that the Austrians would want to revisit the old dream. If they were allowed to build an enclave at their doorstep, wouldn't it make the whole of France sleepless? However, the conditions proposed by Austria this time are quite generous. They only want to return Luxembourg's territory and turn Liège into a free trade zone point, and our side will get the Walloon territory, except Liège and West Luxembourg, which has an educated and high quality population of more than 1 million. It is also rich in coal and iron resources, making France covet it. The conditions offered by the other side of the strait were to assign Luxembourg to France, after defeating the German Confederation, and to allow the establishment of a Franco-Belgian customs union. In comparison, it is obvious that the commitment given by the Austrians was much more affordable. If they really sent out troops rashly as the British requested, I'm afraid that the first batch of French troops to enter Wallonia would have become prisoners by now. Although France was expanding crazily at this time, its power was actually stretched thin. The French invested a lot in the colonies. At first, they could rely on bankers, but as time went by, their shortcomings became apparent. With the exception of Texas, all the French colonies were losing money. One was because input-output was not proportional, and the other was because maintenance costs were staggeringly high. All of this is of course due to the obstruction of the United Kingdom and the United States. If France really chooses to fight to the end with the German Confederation at this time, I'm afraid that Louis Philippe will follow the footsteps of Louis XVI within a few months, because the national treasury has been the whole country is relying on debt to survive. Of course, it is due to the very covert methods. Many great powers are unaware of the emptiness within France, including France. That is why he is working non-stop to provoke conflicts between the two powers of Britain and France. He does not know that France today, as we are already stretched thin and struggling to cope. All-out war with the German Confederacy? Louis Philippe would definitely not choose this. He was still thinking about how to use political means to keep Belgium. Fortunately, the Austrians had found a solution for him, just as someone happened to give him a pillow when he was about to rest. But the kind-hearted Louis Philippe still had to pretend to be reluctant and tearfully divided Belgium. Chapter 375 Human Dreams Will Never End. Amsterdam, the Netherlands. The Dutch army has been assembled and is about to head to the front line. The 80,000 strong army is almost all the assets of the Netherlands. In order to regain Flemish, King William II of the Netherlands thought it was worth a try. In fact, he was betting on the fate of the country and the character of the Habsburg family. Because there were less than 20,000 troops stationed in the Netherlands at this time, it was actually an empty shell. If the Austrian Empire takes this opportunity to launch an attack on the Netherlands, then William II will inevitably suffer the same fate of exile overseas as his ancestors. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon once named his younger brother King of the Netherlands, known as Ludwig II in history. In fact, William II was not a gambler at all. He just had a new lover who always liked to play a few games. This lady's gambling skills were superb, and she could always make William II kill everyone at the gambling table. Over time, this timid king turned into a gambler. This time when William II was wavering, it was his lover who made the decision for him. The reason is, although Britain is close at hand, its reinforcements are far away, and although Austria is 840 kilometers away from the Netherlands, their troops have already arrived in Luxembourg. The United Kingdom has promised us that, as long as we try our best to preserve our territorial integrity. Who is responsible for the incompleteness of the Dutch territory at this time? Although Austria will transfer the province of Limburg to Luxembourg, you will still be the nominal monarch of Luxembourg. At the same time, Austria will return the Flemish region to you, and Austria is also willing to serve as a penal colony for local Catholics. Are you going to let 100,000 Dutch soldiers die in vain, waiting for the illusory reinforcement, or are you willing to take back the territory that truly belongs to you at the expense of Limburg? At this time, William II received new news. The Austrians had occupied Flemish and captured King Leopold I of Belgium. They had sent envoys to the palace to urge him to take over the place as soon as possible. This surprised and delighted William II. He was delighted that Austria kept its promise and captured Flemish without even needing the Dutch to send troops. He was also surprised. The Flemish region was the core area of Belgian rule, and Brussels itself was a city built on a fortress, but the Austrians captured this strong city before their troops could be assembled, not to mention the Walloon region, which was the only way to attack Flemish province. It was really scary to conquer the whole of Belgium in less than a week. This convinced him that the Austrians had completed mobilization and deployment before the war began. If he rejects the Austrian proposal, he will now either become a prisoner like Leopold I, or he will face attacks from two directions. Let General Gerrit receive it. King William of the Netherlands ordered. General Gerrit woke up from the shock. As an army general, he was far more shocked than others at this time. Is this the rebirth of Napoleon? General Gerrit couldn't believe the speed of Austria's advance. On the other hand, he was also wondering who this Archduke Albrecht was. Although Archduke Albrecht was very famous in the Austrian Empire, he was not well known in either European military circles or aristocratic circles. One is because he acts too low-key, or is unsociable. The second reason is because of the age issue. At that time, whether in the military or political circles, seniority was required. Limburg for Flanders. In fact, the happiest person about this transaction is the abdicated King William I of the Netherlands. William I was called the Merchant King, but this was not just a disparagement, but also a praise for his outstanding achievements in economic development. However, William I was not satisfied with the title of Merchant King. He wanted to completely unify the North and South. The South refers to the Austrian Netherlands and other regions, and become the true king of the Netherlands. It is a pity that William I's business methods had a counterproductive effect on the people, and at the same time, the malicious intentions from overseas did not want the Netherlands to be unified and strong. In the end, he could only sit back and watch his country divide and abdicate. Sadly, when the news of the Dutch army's recapture of Flemish spread back to the country, William I locked himself in a room. He took out the bottle of gin that was 13 years old from the cabinet and drank it down. 13 years ago, France sent troops and Belgium became independent. The scene of him abdicating sadly seemed like it happened yesterday. 12 months later, the 71-year-old former King William I of the Netherlands boarded the merchant ship on which he traveled all over the world when he was young. Here he seemed to feel his passionate heart again, the sea that made his heart surge, and the sea that made him feel happy. Fascinated by the world, he never looked back to his motherland, the Greater Netherlands. People's dreams never end. On December 12, 1843, the former Dutch King William I passed away. The book returns to its true story. At the Franco-Belgian border, 20,000 French advance troops crossed the Franco-Belgian border in a mighty manner, preparing to take over the Walloon region in advance. The reason why the French army violated its agreement with the German Confederation was because Louis-Philippe hoped to get a more favorable situation, while Guizot wanted to leave room for negotiations with the British. This of course requires cutting off the Austrians' retreat. According to their intelligence, the First Army of the German Confederation, Austrian army, is heading towards the Flemish region at this time. If the French army occupied Wallonia at this time, France would be in an invincible position, whether negotiating terms with the British or the German Confederation. The 20,000 French troops ignored the warnings of the German Confederate volunteers and forcibly broke through the Franco-Belgian border. They went straight to the important military town of Namur fortress along the waypoint. After receiving the news that the Prussian vanguard was defeated, Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig felt humiliated. The Austrians in front were about to return victoriously, but he was defeated by 20,000 French troops who broke through the defense line. Wilhelm Friedrich Ludwig was the famous cannonball prince in history, the first emperor of the German Empire. Wilhelm I, an emperor with a bad temper at this time. His army staff officer was Moltke, a famous figure in military history. Both of them felt that it was too shameful to be defeated by a mere 20,000 French troops. Although this group of French troops came to cut off the Austrian army's retreat, the entire German Confederation had hundreds of thousands of troops here, and Albrecht himself had nearly 3 dozen troops. It is not difficult for a force of 10,000 to defeat this French army of only 20,000 people. In addition, the Dutch have sent 100,000 troops, allegedly, to support the German Confederation. If Namur is lost in this battle, let alone leading Germany in the future, they may be expelled from the German Confederation. The armies of the German Confederacy were not uniformly dispatched, and most of them acted independently, and were vulnerable to the powerful French army. This also gave the French general Jean Derdon undue self-confidence. Coupled with the lack of intelligence, he believed that there were only a few thousand German Confederate troops in the Wallonia region at most. As long as he occupied Namur, he could completely reverse the situation of the war. To achieve true central flowering point, I finished this chapter before, but I thought it was a bit too bland, so I revised it, and now I feel it was a bit too much point. I will sort out my thoughts tomorrow. If I can think of something, I will update it as usual. If I can't think of it, I will continue to do it. Point goo 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 goo. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.